The classroom did not go quiet because Ren Calder said anything. It went quiet because Draxus Kell closed his hand around her wrist hard enough to leave 4 dents in the skin, and she did not move, and she did not make a sound, and she did not look away from him. "Show me," Draxus said. "Show me the thing they redacted." 26 cadets sat very still around them. Instructor Sol Idren, small and feathered and halfway through a sentence about threat calibration, stopped with her beak open and her stylus raised over the projection table. Nobody in the room breathed the way people breathe when they have decided nothing is actually going to happen. They breathed the way people breathe when they have decided something is. Ren looked down at the hand on her wrist, then back up at Draxus Kell's face and said, in a voice that did not rise at all, "You should let go of my arm." That was the whole of it. That was the sentence that started everything that followed. Threshold Academy sat inside Corona Station, a wheel of gray hull plate turning in a slow arc above a neutral world that belonged to no single power in the compact, which was the entire point of it. 9 species sent cadets there. 9 species that otherwise avoided sharing a room, a mess hall, or a chain of command, put their young officers into the same wheel and told them to learn to fight beside one another instead of learning it for the first time on a battlefield where the mistake would be paid for in hulls and crews. It mostly worked. It had worked for 60 years. It worked because the instructors were good and the cadets were smart, and the whole architecture of the place ran on one unglamorous, unromantic idea, that you could not outshoot a war you did not understand, and understanding started in a classroom. Applied threat doctrine was on paper the driest course on the roster. Cadets called it the ledger class because most of the semester was spent working through the compact's threat register, the tiered rating system that told a young officer, before she ever set foot on a strange world, roughly how badly it could kill her. Ledger green meant a garden with teeth. Ledger amber meant pack predators and hostile weather. Ledger crimson meant a planet that had produced, on its own, something capable of contesting a compact battle line, and there were 4 of those on record, and cadets studied all 4 in detail, with casualty numbers and terrain maps and after-action transcripts, because that was how you survived meeting 1. And then there was Ledger Black. There was exactly 1 entry under Ledger Black in the whole register, and it had no casualty numbers, no terrain maps, no after-action transcripts. It had a name, Earth, and a line of text that every cadet in that room had read at least a dozen times because it was, without competition, the strangest sentence in the entire 90-year history of compact threat classification. Rating withheld at originating species request. Classification maintained by mutual treaty. Full data available to Fleet Command on declaration of state emergency only. Humans had written their own rating and then sealed it. Nobody made you seal your own file. You sealed a file because either the truth was worse than anything Fleet Command wanted broadcast to 9 species of nervous allies, or because you wanted people to think that, and there was no way, from inside a classroom on a station orbiting a neutral rock, to tell which. Ren Calder was one of 4 humans in her cohort, out of 110 cadets, and she had spent 14 months at Threshold learning that this single blank line in an otherwise exhaustively documented textbook was, to a great many of her classmates, the single most interesting thing about her. Most of them handled it fine. A few asked direct, awkward questions in the mess hall, and she answered the ones she could and said, "That's above my clearance too," to the ones she couldn't, which was true, and which most cadets accepted, because rank and clearance games were something every species in the compact understood in their bones. A few treated the blank line as a rumor to be enjoyed rather than a fact to be assessed, and made jokes, and she let them, because jokes cost nothing. Draxus Kell was not in either of those categories. Draxus was V-Horan, from a warrior lineage on a world called Castresh that had never lost a war it started, and he had made it clear in the careful, layered way his species communicated status, that he found the entire idea of a redacted threat rating personally insulting. Not insulting to him, insulting to the register, to the whole discipline of threat doctrine, which existed in the V-Horan philosophy he'd been raised on, to strip away exactly this kind of theater, the myth, the mystery, the unearned reputation, and replace it with hard, tested, defensible numbers. A blank line is not a rating, he'd said, 3 weeks into the semester, the first time the subject came up in class. A blank line is a story someone is telling so they don't have to prove anything. Instructor Idren had let that stand as a discussion point, because it was, technically, a reasonable methodological objection, and Threshold Academy did not exist to protect anyone's feelings about a database entry. Ren had said nothing that day. She had let it go, the way she let most things go, because she had joined the exchange cohort to learn a doctrine and stand a post, not to win arguments about her homeworld's paperwork. But Draxus kept returning to it. 2 weeks later, during a unit on close quarters threat assessment, he'd asked politely, formally, the way his culture demanded challenges be phrased, whether Ledger Black cadets received special dispensation in the sparring rotation, since apparently they were too dangerous to rate. Dren, again, treated it as a fair procedural question and confirmed that no, human cadets sparred under the same rules as everyone else, same padding, same limits, same medical oversight. That had seemed to satisfy him for a while. It had not. What Draxus Kell actually wanted, Ren understood by the 8th week of the semester, was not an answer. It was a demonstration. He wanted the blank line to resolve into a number he could measure himself against, because, in his worldview, a threat you could not measure was not a threat. It was a rank you had not yet taken from someone. Today's class had been a routine review, response protocols for a first contact scenario, worked as a tabletop exercise, species by species, with each cadet asked to describe how their homeworld's military doctrine would handle an unknown hostile. Ren had given her answer when it came her turn: cautious approach, minimal signature, verify before engaging, de-escalate if de-escalation is viable, respond decisively if it is not. Standard. Boring even. Every species in the room had said some close variant of the same thing. Draxus had raised a taloned hand before Idren could move to the next cadet. That is not a doctrine, he'd said. That is a description of how you would like to be seen. I would like to know the actual doctrine, the one behind the blank line. I gave you the actual doctrine, Ren said. You gave me a sentence that could describe a farmer with a rake. Draxus stood. V-Horan were built long through the torso and heavy through the shoulders, and standing made him nearly 2 heads over her sitting height, and the room's easy, half-attentive posture sharpened all at once, the way a mess hall sharpens when someone raises their voice, except he had not raised his voice at all. He had simply stood and crossed the space between his row and hers, and put his hand around her wrist and said, "Show me." That was where the room went quiet. Idren's feathers had gone rigid along her crest, a Malara tell that meant genuine alarm rather than professional interest, and she started to say something, a name, a rank, a formal reprimand beginning to form, and Ren, still not moving her arm, still not raising her voice, cut across it gently. "You should let go of my arm," she said again, because the first time hadn't worked and she believed in giving people a fair second chance to hear her. Or, Draxus said, his grip did not loosen. If anything, it tightened, testing the way you'd test a rope before you trusted your weight to it. That is the question, cadet, or what? What is the actual sentence at the end of that threat? Or is there no sentence, because there is nothing behind the blank line at all? The room had gone from quiet to absolutely still, the particular stillness of 110 young officers from 9 species, all simultaneously deciding not to be the one who moved first. Ren didn't answer him with words. She turned her wrist, not a wrench, not a strike, just a slow quarter turn against the weakest angle of his grip, the kind of motion a physical therapist might use to demonstrate a joint's range, and Draxus's hand came open like it had forgotten it was holding anything, and she stepped back one pace and resumed her seat, and folded her hands on the desk in front of her, and looked at Instructor Idren with the calm, patient expression of a cadet waiting for class to resume. Draxus stood there with his hand still half curled around the shape her wrist had been, staring at it. It had taken Ren perhaps 2/3 of a second. Nobody in the room, except possibly Idren, whose entire professional life was built around clocking exactly this kind of thing, had actually seen the mechanics of it. What they had seen was a V-Horan warrior caste cadet, built to break doors down with his shoulder, holding a human woman's wrist with everything his considerable strength could apply. And then, with no visible effort on her part at all, not holding it anymore. "Cadet Kell," Idren's voice cut through the stillness, sharp now, command sharp. "You will return to your seat, now." Draxus did not look at her. He was still looking at his own hand. "Cadet Kell," Idren said again. He sat down. Slowly, and with his spine very straight, and his eyes never leaving Ren's face. But he sat down, and class resumed in the strained, over-careful way classes resume after everyone in the room has watched something they don't yet have the vocabulary to describe. Ren did not look pleased with herself. She did not look shaken either. She wrote 3 lines of notes about tabletop response protocols in a hand that did not waver, and when the session ended 40 minutes later, she gathered her tablet and stood to leave like it had been an ordinary Tuesday. Draxus was waiting for her by the door. "Formal challenge," he said, quiet enough that it wouldn't carry to the corridor, loud enough that every cadet still filing out of the room heard it anyway. "Academy Code, Article 40. You and me sanctioned floor full oversight. I want the number behind the blank line, Calder. I am owed it. Every cadet in this cohort is owed it. We train beside a species we are told, on threat of court-martial, not to underestimate, and then we are handed a redacted line and asked to take it on faith. I don't take things on faith. I test them." Around them, cadets who had started to file out had mostly stopped filing, angling themselves so they could watch without appearing to watch, the universal posture of witnesses to a fight that has not started yet. Ren considered him for a moment. Not with anger, there was nothing in her face that resembled anger, no tightening around the eyes, no flush, nothing a threat assessment class would have flagged as an emotional escalation. If anything, she looked faintly, genuinely thoughtful, like he'd posed her an interesting logistics problem. "You don't want an answer," she said. "You want a story you can tell afterward. Those aren't the same thing, and one of them is a lot more expensive than you think." "Is that a refusal?" "It's a warning," Ren said. "You get one, that was it." Then she walked past him, out into the corridor, and did not look back. And behind her Draxus Kell stood very still with his jaw set, and around him 110 cadets began, all at once, to talk. By the time Ren reached the human liaison office on the 3rd ring of the station, word of the formal challenge had beaten her there, which did not surprise her. Threshold Academy ran on gossip the way a warship ran on power conduits, invisibly, constantly, and impossible to shut off without shutting off everything else. Colonel Aldous Rain was 61 years old, had one leg from the knee down that was not the leg he'd been born with, and had spent the 20 years before his retirement doing work he did not discuss with cadets, in places whose names did not appear on compact star charts. He ran the small human liaison detachment at Threshold, 4 cadets, 2 support staff, and himself, with the unbothered patience of a man who had stopped being impressed by threats a long time ago. He was sitting behind his desk with a cup of real earth coffee, a small and jealously guarded luxury shipped in on the quarterly supply run, when Ren knocked on his open door. "Sit," he said, not looking up from his tablet. "I already heard 3 versions. One of them has you breaking his wrist. One of them has you doing nothing at all and him backing off because he lost his nerve. I assume the truth is somewhere unglamorous in between. He grabbed my arm, I made him let go. That's all that happened. Ren sat. Then he challenged me under Article 40. Rain set the tablet down. Article 40's real, he said. Academy Code, Oversight Duel, goes back to the founding charter. It's how they used to settle honor disputes between cadet houses before somebody smart figured out it was cheaper to let them fight it out on a padded floor with a medic standing by than let it fester into something that got settled with a knife in a corridor. Sanctioned floor, full medical oversight. A review board watching. Hard stop the moment either combatant yields or the presiding officer calls it. It's not a duel to the death. It hasn't been used in 6 years because most cadets have the sense God gave a rock and settle their honor disputes with words like civilized people. He rubbed his jaw. You could refuse it. Could I? Technically, Rain looked at her for a long moment. Article 40's a right, not an obligation. You decline, it goes to the review board. They issue Kell a formal reprimand for conduct unbecoming, and in 4 months everybody's forgotten about it. He paused. Practically, though, you know what refusing looks like to a room full of cadets who already think we're hiding something behind a blank line in a textbook. It looks like the blank line was hiding a threat rating of 0, Ren said. It looks exactly like that, Rain agreed. You'd spend the rest of your posting here as the human who flinched. Every human who comes after you would spend their posting here the same way. And somewhere out past the neutral zone, there's a V-Horan admiral who spent 30 years arguing in compact council sessions that Earth's rating is theater, a bluff, a diplomatic trick, a species punching above its actual weight and hiding behind a redaction because there's nothing real underneath it. You refuse this, Ren, and you hand him the best evidence he's had in a decade. Ren was quiet for a moment. Outside the office window, Corona Station's slow rotation carried a slice of the neutral world's daylit curve past the glass, blue-white and ordinary and very far from home. He's not wrong that the rating's strange, she said finally. I don't love defending a blank line either. I've read the same redacted file everybody else has read, which is to say, I haven't read it at all, above my clearance. I don't actually know the number, Colonel. Nobody in this cohort does. I know the number, Rain said quietly. I held the clearance for 11 years before I came here. I'm not going to tell you what it is because you don't need it, and because there is a very good reason it's classified above cadet level, and I've never once seen a reason to violate that. Not for curiosity and not for a diplomatic squabble. He leaned forward. But I'll tell you the only part of it that matters for tomorrow's problem. It's not classified because it's low. Ren nodded slowly. So what do I do? You do what you were sent here to do, Rain said. You represent your species with the same doctrine you'd use on an unknown hostile, cautious approach. Verify before engaging. De-escalate if de-escalation's viable. He almost smiled. Respond decisively if it isn't. You've got that memorized, I assume, since you've been reciting it in threat doctrine since week 1. That's not advice. That's my own homework read back at me. Best kind of advice there is, Rain said. Costs nothing and you already knew it was true. He picked his coffee back up. One more thing. If this goes to the floor, and I think it will, because Kell's the proud, stubborn kind of stupid that doesn't back down once he said something in front of a room, you do not let it turn into a display. You are not there to make a point. You are there to end an engagement with the least damage that accomplishes the job. That's not me being soft on you. That's doctrine. The review board will be watching for exactly the difference between a cadet defending herself and a cadet putting on a show, and so, more importantly, will every other species in that room. A show gets remembered as a threat. A clean stop gets remembered as a fact. Ren stood. Understood, Colonel. One more thing. Rain's voice for the first time lost some of its dry unbotheredness. Are you all right? He put a hand on you in front of your whole cohort. Nobody's asked you that yet, I'd bet. Ren considered the question, with the same unhurried honesty she gave everything. I've had worse grips on my arm from people who meant it kindly, she said. It didn't scare me, Colonel. It annoyed me. There's a difference, and I think that difference is exactly the thing he doesn't understand yet. Rain almost laughed, a short dry huff of air. No, he said. I don't imagine he does. Go on. Dean Coleth will want to see you before end of day. She runs a tight ship and she is not going to let this sit unaddressed. Answer her questions straight. Don't volunteer opinions about Kel's character, and let the process do what it's built to do. Wren left the coffee smell and the small, cluttered comfort of the liaison office and walked the long ring corridor toward the administrative core, where Dean Vastur Coleth kept an office with a wraparound viewport that looked directly down on the neutral world's daylit ocean, because Coleth had once told a cadet review board that she liked being reminded, every time she made a hard decision, how small any one decision was against a planet. Dean Coleth was Ithaqui, a species built low and wide with mottled gray-violet skin and 8 fine manipulator limbs that she kept folded with academic precision when she wasn't using them, and she had run Threshold Academy for 11 years with a reputation, across all 9 member species, for being scrupulously, sometimes maddeningly fair. She did not like Article 40. She had said so publicly on more than one occasion. An anachronism, she called it, a relic of an era before the Compact had better tools for managing status disputes between prideful young officers. But she enforced it, because the charter was the charter, and because the one thing Threshold Academy could not survive was a dean who decided which rules of the founding document she liked. She had Wren's incident report already open on her desk display when Wren came in. Alongside, Wren noted, with the small internal flicker of unease she allowed herself and nobody else, a second file with Draxus Kell's disciplinary history, which was, evidently, not blank. Sit, Cadet Calder. Coleth's translated voice ran level and precise, the particular cadence of a species that had learned compact trade tongue as a second language and never quite lost the habit of choosing each word with care. I have Instructor Idren's account, 2 independent cadet statements, and the room's sensor log. They agree with each other and with your incident report. I don't need to interview you about what happened. I need to discuss what happens next. Yes, Dean. Cadet Kell has invoked Article 40. That is his right as the aggrieved party under the challenge's own logic. However absurd, I personally find the notion that he is the aggrieved party in an incident where he initiated unwanted physical contact. A ripple went through Coleth's mantle, the Ithaqui equivalent of a sigh. You may decline. If you decline, I will personally see to it that Cadet Kell receives disciplinary action commensurate with laying hands on a fellow cadet without consent, which is a serious violation regardless of what species is on either end of it. That is a real option, and I want you to hear me say, clearly, that no one at this academy will think less of you for choosing it. I understand, Dean. You may also accept, Coleth went on. If you accept, this becomes a sanctioned floor engagement under full medical and command oversight, governed by rules I will personally review with both combatants before it happens, and it becomes, functionally, a matter of compact record 9 species watching a formal proceeding, not a corridor brawl. I want you to understand the difference in weight between those 2 things before you choose. I understand that too. Coleth's small dark eyes, 4 of them, spaced along a low ridge above her mantle, studied Wren for a long moment. May I ask you something outside the formal record, Cadet? Off the incident report entirely. Of course. Are you afraid of Cadet Kell? Wren thought about the question seriously, the way she thought about most things put to her seriously, instead of reaching for the answer that would sound good. No, she said. I don't think he's dangerous to me. I think he's dangerous to himself, a little in the specific way that people get when they've decided a story has to be true and gone looking for evidence instead of an answer. I'd rather he found the answer some other way. But he's decided this is the way, and I don't think talking him out of it will work anymore, because I already tried twice, and both times he heard a threat where I was making an offer. And if you accept the challenge, what happens on that floor in your professional estimation? Ren was quiet for a moment. I end it, she said, cleanly, as fast as it can be ended without more damage than the situation calls for. That's the doctrine, Dean. I don't have a different one for this. Kolith folded her manipulator limbs, one over another, in the gesture Ren had come to recognize, after 14 months, as the Ithaqui equivalent of a slow, considering nod. Then I will schedule it for 6 days from now, she said. That gives the review board time to convene properly, gives Cadet Kell time to reconsider if he chooses to, and gives you time to prepare, though I suspect preparation is not the primary concern here. She reached out with one limb and closed the incident file with a small, final gesture. For what it's worth, Cadet Calder, and this will not appear in any record, I have run this academy for 11 years, and I have watched a great many young officers walk into my office convinced their species' reputation rode on the next thing they did. Most of them were wrong. It rarely rides on any one thing. She paused. I confess I do not yet know whether you are one of the exceptions. Article 40 will tell us in 6 days. Yes, Dean. Dismissed, Cadet. Ren stood and left the office with its long window of daylit ocean, and walked back out into the ring corridor where the rumor of what had happened in applied threat doctrine had already outpaced her twice over, growing new limbs and new details with every retelling, the way rumors always did in 110 cadet cohort with 6 days and nothing better to do than wait. Fane Kor was waiting outside the mess hall when Ren finally got there, having eaten nothing since breakfast and not particularly caring. Fane was Melara, like Instructor Idren, but younger and smaller, and still carrying the soft downy feathering of a cadet who hadn't finished her second growth cycle, barely a meter and a half standing, built for the archive towers and library decks of her homeworld rather than for a combat cohort, which was exactly why she'd ended up rooming across the corridor from Ren in the first place. Melara sent very few cadets to Threshold's combat track. Fane was there on a records-end liaison specialization, cataloging threat doctrine updates for her government, and she had spent 14 months being politely, thoroughly overlooked by almost everyone in the cohort except Ren, who had started sharing a mess table with her in the second week of the term for no reason either of them had ever bothered to articulate, and had kept doing it ever since. Everyone is saying you broke his hand, Fane said, falling into step beside her, quick and light-footed to match Ren's longer stride. Someone in the archive deck told me you broke 3 fingers. Someone else told me you didn't touch him at all and he simply let go because he realized what he was holding. I have heard 4 different versions in the last hour, and I catalog things for a living, Ren, and I cannot make any of them agree with each other. I didn't break anything, Ren said. I turned my wrist. He let go because it hurt to keep holding on, not because I broke anything. That is a very unsatisfying version of the story for the rumor mill. Fane's crest feathers flattened with something that, on a human, would have read as worry. He challenged you. Article 40. That is not a training bout, Ren. I looked up the last time it was invoked 6 years ago, 2 Threll cadets, over a succession dispute neither of them would drop. One of them spent 11 days in the infirmary. I know what Article 40 is. Then you know it is not a small thing to accept. I know that too. Ren stopped walking and Fane stopped with her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, standing in the ring corridor with cadets from 6 species flowing around them on their way to evening mess. I'm not going to pretend this doesn't matter, Fane. It matters, but it isn't complicated. He wants to know something. I know the answer. Eventually he was always going to ask in a way I couldn't just talk my way around because that's who he is. This is just sooner than I would have picked. You could have declined. I could have, Ren agreed. And then every cadet in this cohort would have spent the rest of the term believing the blank line in the register is a bluff. That's not a neutral outcome, Fane. That's a worse one than this. Fane was quiet for a moment, her small dark eyes moving across Ren's face with the particular intensity of a species built to read documents for meaning that wasn't stated on the surface. "You are not frightened," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "No." "That is the part I find strange," Fane admitted. "Not that you would fight him, that you are not frightened of fighting him. I have seen you spar in the training halls, Ren. You are good. You are not, forgive me, I say this with respect, you are not built like he is built. He could put both hands around your ribcage. I have done the math on the mass differential, and it is not encouraging." "Mass isn't the whole equation," Ren said. "It's a big piece of most equations. It's not this one." They walked on into the mess hall together, and if either of them noticed the way conversation dipped and eyes tracked sideways as they crossed the floor to their usual table, neither said anything about it, because there was nothing useful to say about 100 cadets deciding, in real time, whether the quiet human at the corner table was about to become a very different kind of story than the one they'd been telling about her for 14 months. The 6 days that followed did not proceed quietly. On the second day, Ren found her training locker had been gone through. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, but her gear rearranged with a precision clearly meant to be noticed rather than concealed, a message rather than a theft. She reported it to the duty officer, who logged it and could not identify the responsible party, and Ren said nothing further about it to anyone, including Fane, though Fane noticed the new lock on the locker 2 days later and drew her own conclusions. On the third day, in the training hall during open sparring hours, a Threll cadet named Oskavir, heavyset, quiet, from a species that prized restraint almost as strongly as the V-Horan prized strength, asked to spar with her, formally, on the padded floor, in full view of a training hall that had quietly filled up with spectators who were technically there for their own scheduled bouts, and were, in practice, watching one mat and nothing else. Ren said yes. It seemed easier than explaining why she might say no. Oskavir was strong, fast for his bulk, and disciplined, and the bout lasted 40 seconds before Ren put him on the mat with a leg sweep and a controlled arm lock that stopped a full measured distance short of anything that would actually injure him, and held it there for exactly as long as it took him to tap the mat twice, and then released him immediately and offered him a hand up. He took it. He was not angry. He looked, if anything, thoughtful, the same way Draxus had looked thoughtful before he decided to stop being thoughtful and start being certain. "You could have finished that faster," Oskavir said, rubbing his shoulder. "I could have," Ren agreed. "Why didn't you?" "Because finishing it faster wasn't necessary to finish it," Ren said. "There's a difference between the fastest way to end something and the smallest way to end something. I try to use the smaller one when I can." Oskavir looked at her for a long moment, then at the training hall's silent, watching crowd, then back at her. "That is not the answer I expected," he said, and walked away without further comment, and did not challenge her again, though he did, Ren noticed over the following days, start quietly discouraging other cadets from doing the same in the low, understated way Threll cadets discourage things they'd privately decided were unwise. Draxus Kell did not spar with her during those 6 days. He trained instead, obsessively, publicly, in a way clearly calculated to be seen. He worked with the training hall's heaviest resistance rigs for hours at a stretch. He brought in weighted sparring gear from his homeworld's own quartermaster stores, gear built for V-Horan combat conditioning that most of the station's equipment lockers didn't stock. He sparred 3 separate V-Horan cadets in succession one evening, and put all 3 of them on the mat inside a minute apiece, and stood over the last one breathing hard and not looking satisfied at all, because none of it was the fight he actually wanted. On the 4th day, Ren was crossing the ring corridor toward the archive deck when she heard raised voices from an alcove off the main passage. Fane's voice, tight and quick, and a second voice, low and hard, that she recognized before she'd even turned the corner. Draxus had Fane backed against the alcove wall. He wasn't touching her. He didn't need to. The size differential alone did the work. Draxus a head and a half taller, and built through the shoulder like something meant to break doors. Fane small and downy-feathered, and pressed back with her wings half-mantled in the reflexive threat display of a prey species that had never expected to need one at Threshold Academy. "Tell your friend," Draxus was saying, "that this stops being a private matter for her the moment it becomes a public humiliation for everyone who has to explain afterward why a redacted rating was allowed to stand unchallenged for 60 years. Tell her that if she declines to show me something real on that floor, I will not be the only one asking why." "I have told you," Fane said, and her voice shook, but she did not look away from him, which cost her something visible, "that this has nothing to do with me. I am not part of your dispute." "Everyone in this cohort is part of my dispute," Draxus said. "That is what a blank line does. It makes everyone's safety someone else's unverified claim." "Kel." Ren's voice came from the alcove entrance, flat and quiet, and Draxus turned. She had not raised it. She had not needed to. Something in the two syllables of his name, said in exactly that register, carried a weight that made Fane's shoulders drop half an inch in relief, and made Draxus go very still. The stillness of a predator recalibrating a distance it had misjudged. "This doesn't involve her," Ren said. "It never did. If you have something to say to me, you have 6 days left to say it on the floor where it's scheduled to be said. Until then, you don't speak to her again. Not about me. Not about the register. Not at all." "Or," Draxus said, and there was something almost hopeful in the word, like he'd been waiting 4 days for exactly this opening. "Or nothing," Ren said. "There's no or, Kel. This isn't a negotiation. You made a formal request, I accepted it, and it will be settled on a sanctioned floor in front of a review board, the way you yourself insisted it should be. That's the whole of our business. She isn't leverage. She was never leverage. If you thought threatening someone smaller than you would make me angrier or more careless going into that floor, I want you to understand clearly that it did the opposite. It told me exactly what kind of fight you actually want, and it isn't the one you keep saying you want." For a long moment Draxus didn't move. Then he stepped back from the alcove wall not far, a single controlled pace, but enough that Fane could straighten off the paneling and put real distance between them, and looked at Ren with an expression that had, for the first time in 6 days, something other than certainty in it. "2 days," he said. "The board convenes in 2 days. You will show me the number Calder, one way or another." "I'll show you what I already told you I'd show you," Ren said. "An answer, not a story. You keep asking for the second thing and calling it the first." Draxus held her gaze a moment longer, then turned and walked away down the ring corridor without another word, and the sound of his boots on the deck plating carried for a long time after he'd gone. Fane let out a breath that had clearly been held far too long. "I did not tell you because I did not want you distracted going into this," she said before Ren could ask. "I am sorry. That was a mistake. I should have reported it immediately." "You should have," Ren agreed gently. "Not because I needed to know for my sake, because that's assault under Academy code regardless of what species is standing where, and you deserved it on the record whether or not it connects to me at all." She put a hand briefly on Fane's shoulder. The downy feathers were soft and trembling faintly under her palm, and then let it drop. "Are you all right?" "I am small and I catalog documents for a living, and a very large angry reptile backed me into a wall," Fane said, with a shakiness that was trying, gamely, to sound like dry humor and not quite managing it. "I do not think all right is the correct word, but I am not hurt. He did not touch me. He is disciplined enough not to have done that even now, which I confess I find almost more unsettling than if he had simply lost control. He hasn't lost control once through any of this, Ren said quietly, half to herself. That's the part everyone keeps missing. He isn't out of control. He's completely in control, and he's decided this is what control looks like. She looked down the empty corridor where he'd gone. Report it, formally, today. I mean that, Fane. Fane reported it that afternoon. Dean Kolith summoned Draxus Kell to her office within the hour, and whatever was said in that meeting was never entered into any record Ren was permitted to see. But Draxus emerged from it an hour later with his jaw set, and his shoulders squared in a way that read, to anyone who'd watched him for 6 days, less like a reprimand received than a decision confirmed. 2 days later, the review board convened. The review board met in a chamber on the administrative ring that Ren had walked past 100 times without ever going inside. A plain room, tiered seating in a shallow arc. A long table at the front where 3 officers would sit in judgment. And, she noted with a small jolt of surprise, a public gallery at the back that was already half full an hour before the session was scheduled to start. She had not expected an audience for procedure. She should have. Nothing at Threshold Academy happened in private for long. Dean Kolith presided, flanked by Instructor Idren, and a 3rd officer Ren didn't recognize. A broad-shouldered, sand-colored Threll captain introduced as Oskavir's own senior liaison, brought in specifically because he had no stake in either combatant species and could not plausibly be accused of favoring one side. That, Ren understood, watching Kolith arrange the small formalities of the room with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, was the entire design of Article 40. Not to settle who was right, but to make sure that whatever was settled could not be dismissed afterward as biased. Draxus sat at a table on the left with a V-Horan advocate beside him. A formal role, Ren gathered, something closer to a second than a lawyer, whose job was to confirm the challenge had been properly issued and properly accepted rather than to argue anything. Ren sat at the mirrored table on the right, alone, because she had declined Rain's offer to stand as her second, on the grounds that she did not need anyone speaking for her in a room built entirely around the principle that both parties spoke for themselves. What she had not expected, and what made the gallery's early, restless fullness suddenly make sense, was the 4th chair at Draxus's table. He was old, by V-Horan standards, scarred along one side of his jaw in a way that had clearly never been repaired because V-Horan culture didn't repair scars. It displayed them. And he wore a formal harness of dark plate that marked him, even to Ren's still developing eye for V-Horan rank insignia, as something well above cadet or even instructor status. He had arrived on the last supply shuttle. She learned later, on 12 hours' notice, from a compact council session 3 jumps away where he had apparently been in the middle of testifying. His name, according to the murmur running through the gallery before Kolith called the session to order, was Threx Kell, Fleet Marshal Threx Kell, Draxus's granduncle, and for the last 9 years, the most persistent, most articulate voice in the entire compact council, arguing that the redacted human threat rating was exactly what Draxus had called it in an empty alcove on a bad afternoon. A story, not an answer. A diplomatic bluff dressed in official paperwork, propping up an outsized human voice in compact affairs that its actual capability didn't earn. Ren understood, sitting there in the mirrored silence of the right-hand table, that this had stopped being a dispute between 2 cadets sometime in the last 2 days, and that she had not been told, and that it had probably stopped being that from the very beginning. Dean Kolith called the session to order. This is a hearing under Article 40 of the Threshold Academy Founding Charter, she said, her translated voice pitched to carry to the full gallery without strain. Its purpose is narrow. It is not a trial. It does not adjudicate the truth or falsehood of any claim about any species' capability. It exists to confirm that a challenge has been properly issued, properly accepted, and will be conducted under conditions that protect both combatants and the integrity of this institution. I will now read the terms into the record. She read them. Wren had read them herself 3 times over the preceding 6 days, but hearing them spoken aloud in the flat cadence of formal record-keeping made them land differently, heavier, more final. The engagement would take place on the sanctioned floor of the primary training hall, 6 days from the original challenge, before a standing review board and any cadets or staff who wished to observe. Both combatants would be examined by a neutral medical officer immediately prior and would submit to full medical oversight throughout, with authority to halt the engagement at any point on medical grounds. Padding requirements would be waived at Cadet Kell's formal request and Cadet Calder's formal consent, bare engagement, full contact, the traditional form of the article, though strikes to be pulled short of intentional lethal force by either party's own judgment and restraint, which was, Wren reflected, a strange thing to write into a rulebook, an instruction to trust the very restraint that had brought them to this room because someone had run out of it. The engagement would end the moment either combatant yielded, was rendered unable to continue, or the presiding officer called a halt. No weapons, no outside assistance, no second engagement permitted regardless of outcome. Article 40 settled a dispute once, permanently, and neither party could invoke it again against the other. Cadet Kell, Coleth's 4 small eyes settled on him. You issued this challenge. Do you confirm the terms as read, and do you understand that this hearing exists to determine your fitness and sincerity to proceed, not the merits of the underlying dispute? I confirm the terms. Draxus's voice was steady, formal, entirely without the raw edge it had carried in the alcove. I issue this challenge in good faith to establish, through direct and honorable engagement, an answer to a question this cohort has been denied for the entirety of the current term. I bear no grievance against Cadet Calder as an individual. I bear a grievance against a policy of concealment that places every officer in this cohort at a disadvantage they did not consent to. It was, Wren thought, watching him say it, a genuinely well-constructed sentence, and she suspected glancing, for just a moment, at the old scarred face of Fleet Marshal Threx Kell, sitting motionless and attentive at the table beside his grandnephew, that it had not been entirely Draxus's own construction. Cadet Calder, Coleth turned to her. You have been formally challenged under Article 40. Do you accept the terms as read, and do you understand that acceptance is final and once entered into this record, cannot be withdrawn except by mutual consent of both parties? Wren stood. I accept the terms, she said. Her voice did not carry the formal cadence Draxus's had. It was plain, unhurried, the same register she used to answer a question in threat doctrine class. I want the record to reflect one thing, though, since I'm permitted to speak. I'm not accepting this to settle a policy dispute about concealment. I don't run policy. I'm a cadet, same as him. I'm accepting it because a member of my cohort put his hand on me without my consent in front of a room of witnesses, and then escalated that into threatening a smaller cadet who had nothing to do with either of us, and I don't believe that kind of conduct should be answered by declining to answer it. That's the whole of my reasoning. I have no interest in what it proves about the rest of the galaxy's opinion of my homeworld. A ripple went through the gallery, not loud, nothing so crude as a murmur, but a shift, dozens of small postural adjustments across 100 watching cadets, the sound a room makes when it has just heard something it wasn't quite expecting inside a formal proceeding. Fleet Marshal Threx Kell's scarred jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Dean Coleth's mantle rippled once, and if it was amusement, it did not show anywhere else on her face. Noted for the record, Coleth said. The board finds the challenge properly issued and properly accepted. This hearing is closed. The engagement will proceed in accordance with the terms read into this record, 4 days from today, at 1400 hours, Primary Training Hall. Both combatants will report to the medical officer for pre-engagement clearance 1 hour prior. She rose, all 8 limbs unfolding with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. I would remind everyone in this gallery, cadet and instructor alike, that Article 40 exists to prevent disputes from being settled badly. It is not entertainment. Any cadet found treating it as such will answer to me directly. The gallery took that instruction with the particular seriousness a room gives an instruction it has no intention of fully obeying, and by the time Wren left the chamber, she could already hear, faintly, through the corridor doors, the low, busy hum of 110 cadets from 9 species beginning to talk about odds. Rain caught up with her outside. "That was a mistake," he said without preamble, falling into step beside her, not accepting the other part, telling the room your reason instead of letting them make up their own. "Was it?" "You made it personal," Rain said. "Made it about him laying hands on a cadet, not about the register." "That's true, and I respect the hell out of you for saying it plainly in front of the marshal instead of playing his game. But you should know what you just did. You just told 110 cadets and one very well-connected fleet marshal that this fight isn't about proving anything about Earth. Which means when you win, and Wren, I need you to hear me say this without flinching. When you win, some of them are going to remember it as you settling a personal score, not as evidence of anything. Kel's granduncle is going to walk away from this still arguing the register's a bluff, because in his framing, none of this ever tested the actual question. You just gave him an exit." Wren considered that for a moment as they walked. "Good," she said finally. Rain glanced at her, surprised. "I'm not trying to prove anything to Fleet Marshal Kell," she said. "I never was. I don't think anybody should have to prove anything about an entire species by putting one 22-year-old woman on a padded floor against one 24-year-old man who's angry about a database entry. That's not what the rating's for, Colonel. It was never supposed to be a challenge trophy. If he walks away still arguing it's a bluff, that's his problem to carry, not mine to fix. My problem is smaller than his. My problem is Draxus Kell, on a floor in 4 days, and making sure that whatever happens there, it happens the smallest way it can happen and still actually stop him." Rain was quiet for a long moment, walking beside her down the long curve of the ring corridor, the daylit ocean sliding slowly past the viewports on their left. "You know," he said finally, "I've met a lot of officers who thought small like that. Most of them learned it the hard way, someplace with a lot fewer witnesses than this one's going to have. Where'd you learn it?" "Search and rescue," Wren said. "Before the academy track. 4 years pulling people out of collapsed structures and flooded gorges back home, in weather most sane people don't go outside in. You learn fast that the job isn't to look impressive doing the rescue. The job is that the person comes out alive and you don't put yourself or your team in the ground doing it. Impressive gets people killed. Smallest effective action gets people out." She looked over at him. "It's the same doctrine, Colonel. It always was. Nobody at this academy ever taught me anything I hadn't already learned pulling a stranger out of a river with 2 broken ribs and a hairline fracture in my own arm." Rain didn't say anything for a while after that. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its dry edge. 4 days, he said. "Eat well, sleep when you can. And Wren, when it's your turn on that floor, don't you dare perform for that gallery. Not for Kell, not for his granduncle, not for the 9 species that are about to place bets on you like you're a prize fight. You do the job the way you'd have done it pulling somebody out of a river. Smallest effective action. Let the room draw its own conclusions from that. It will. It always does." "Yes, Colonel." "Good." He stopped at the junction where their corridors split, and for a moment looked like he might say something else, and didn't, and instead just nodded once, the small economical nod of a man who had said everything that needed saying and trusted her to carry the rest of it herself. Wren walked the remaining distance to her quarters alone, through a station that had, in the space of a single afternoon, stopped talking about a redacted line in a textbook and started talking, instead, about her. The 4 days passed the way the 6 had, visibly, publicly, with the whole slow gravity of the station, bending itself around a single event, neither combatant could now step back from. By the 2nd day, Cadets Wren had never spoken to or nodding to her in corridors with a new, careful respect that felt less like admiration than like insurance. The reflexive courtesy people extend to something they've decided might be dangerous, just in case. By the 3rd day, a scarred cadet in her navigation elective, an insected with faceted blue chitinous eyes who had never said more than a dozen words to her across 14 months, sat down across from her at breakfast unprompted and asked, with the blunt directness of a species that found human social hedging baffling, whether she thought she would win. "I don't think about it that way," Wren told her. "That is not an answer." "It's the only one I've got," Wren said. "Thinking about winning puts your attention on the wrong thing. I think about what happens on the floor, one action at a time, and I let the outcome be whatever the actions add up to. If I spend 4 days imagining a victory, I walk onto that floor already halfway distracted by a story in my own head, instead of paying attention to what's actually in front of me." The scarred cadet considered this with her mandibles working slowly, a gesture Wren had learned, over 14 months, meant something like careful thought rather than any kind of hunger. "Among my people," she said finally, "we say that a hunter who dreams of the kill before the hunt has already lost half her attention to something that has not happened yet. I did not expect a human to understand this. I am told your species is impulsive, emotional, quick to anger." "Some of us are," Wren said. "I try not to be on the clock." "Off the clock's a different matter." The cadet's mandibles clicked once, which Wren had also learned by now was something close to a laugh. "I have wagered on you," she admitted. "Against my own better financial judgment, given the mass differential, but my instincts say otherwise. I did not expect to be telling a human this over a breakfast tray. My world does not typically permit expressing confidence in an outsider before a proving fight. It is considered a kind of theft, taking credit for an outcome you had no hand in earning." "Then don't tell anyone else," Wren said, not unkindly. "I don't need the pressure of being somebody's investment." The betting, once it had a name put to it in front of her, turned out to be extensive, and largely conducted in currencies and favors Wren didn't fully understand and didn't ask about. And Rain, when she mentioned it to him over the 3rd afternoon, just shook his head and said that Article 40 had been drawing wagers since long before either of them had been born, and that the compact's various gambling prohibitions had never once found a foothold against 100 board. Competitive young officers with 6 days and a formal duel to fill them. What worried Wren more than the betting was the second V-Horan cadet. His name was Sarek, a broad, quiet cadet 2 years senior to Draxus, and on the 3rd evening he approached Wren in the training hall alone, without an audience, which she noted and appreciated, and told her, in careful, formal, compact trade tongue, that he wanted her to understand something before the floor. "Draxus is not a cruel man," he said. "I have known him since we were hatchlings. He is proud and stubborn, and he has spent his whole life in the shadow of a granduncle whose entire career has been built on one argument, and he has absorbed that argument so completely that he cannot tell any more where the marshal's convictions end and his own begin. He believes, genuinely believes, that he is doing something honorable, correcting a deception. He does not see what the rest of us see, watching from outside it." "What do the rest of you see?" Sarek was quiet for a moment. "A young man who has spent 6 days training against padded rigs and other V-Horan cadets, preparing for a fight he has already decided the shape of in his own head," he said. "I do not know what you actually are, Cadet Calder. None of us do. That is rather the point of the blank line. But I have watched him prepare for a fight against an opponent his own imagination constructed, and I do not think that opponent is you." I think it is closer to his granduncle's argument given a body to stand against. I wanted you to know that before the floor, not because it should change anything you do there. Only because I thought you should walk onto it understanding what you are actually facing, since I do not think he understands it himself. Why tell me this? Ren asked. You're his cohort mate, his own species. Because I have also watched him for 6 days, Sarek said, and some part of me is afraid of what happens to him if he gets what he thinks he wants. A confirmed answer that the Register is a bluff would validate the worst instincts of half our fleet command. And I'm more afraid still of what happens to him if the answer is the opposite one, and he finds out the hard way, on a floor, in front of everyone, instead of finding it out some gentler way first. He inclined his head, a small formal V-Horan gesture of leave-taking. I do not know which outcome is more dangerous for him. I only know I would rather you went in understanding there is a person under all that certainty, whatever happens to him on that floor. He left before Ren could answer, and she stood alone in the training hall for a long moment afterward, turning the conversation over, before she went back to the slow, unhurried work of her own preparation, not drills, not weighted rigs, not the visible performative training Draxus had been putting on for 6 days running. She spent an hour on breathing control. She spent 40 minutes on footwork so basic it would have looked, to anyone watching, like nothing at all. She ate on schedule. She slept 8 hours a night, which she suspected, correctly, that Draxus had not managed once in the entire 6 days since the challenge. On the morning of the 4th day, an hour before the medical clearance, Fleet Marshal Threx Kell found her in the ring corridor outside the training hall, alone, apparently by design, the corridor unusually empty at that hour, cadets diverted elsewhere by some scheduling adjustment Ren suspected had not been an accident. Cadet called her. His voice in person carried a rough, gravel-worn quality the translator only partially smoothed. A moment of your time. Marshal. He studied her for a long moment with the unhurried, cataloging attention of a man who had spent decades assessing threats for a living and had never entirely switched the habit off. I have argued for 9 years before the full Compact Council that your species rating is theater, he said. I want you to understand that I did not arrive at that position out of malice. I arrived at it because I have spent 40 years building fleet doctrine on verified numbers, and a blank line is not a number, and an alliance that makes policy around an unverified claim is an alliance building its house on sand. I have watched 3 species in my lifetime bluff their way into outsized influence on the strength of a reputation nobody could confirm or deny, and I have watched the Compact pay for it badly when the bluff finally came due. That's a reasonable position to hold, Marshal, Ren said. I don't think you're wrong to want verified numbers. I think you've picked a bad way to get one. His scarred jaw tightened slightly. My grandnephew is not a bad soldier, he said, and something in the register shifted, some of the formal distance dropping away. He is proud, and he is young, and I will confess to you, Cadet, that some part of what happens on that floor today is my doing and not only his. I have spent his whole cadet career telling him that certainty is a virtue, and that a species which will not show its numbers is a species that has something to hide. He absorbed that more completely than I intended him to. He paused. I am not here to ask you for mercy. Mercy is not a request an officer of my rank makes on behalf of a cadet who chose his own challenge. I am here to ask you one question, and I would like an honest answer if you are willing to give one. Ask it. Are you going to kill him? The question hung in the empty corridor for a moment, plain and unadorned. None of the careful diplomatic phrasing the Marshal had used up to that point. No, Ren said. Why not? If the rating is what I believe it is not, if it is real, if it is what 9 years of council argument insists it cannot be, then a genuine engagement against a cadet a third your mass differential's disadvantage should end, by any reasonable combat doctrine, in a decisive result. Decisive results, at the level you are rumored to represent, are not typically gentle. Ren looked at him for a long moment. Because killing him wouldn't answer your question, Marshal, she said. It would just end the conversation. You'd have a dead cadet and a rating you still couldn't verify, because a body on a floor doesn't tell you anything except that something died. I'm not interested in giving you a body. I'm interested in giving you an answer, and answers are things people have to be alive to hear and understand. She held his gaze. I told your grandnephew the same thing 6 days ago, and he heard a threat where I meant exactly what I said. I hope you hear it differently, Marshal, because you've had considerably more practice listening to things you don't want to be true. Threxkel studied her for a long moment, and something moved behind his old scarred eyes that Ren couldn't fully name. Not agreement, not yet, but something adjacent to it, the first crack in 9 years of certainty. We will see, he said finally, and inclined his head and walked away down the corridor without further comment. And Ren stood alone for a moment longer before she turned and went to find the medical officer for her clearance, 4 hours before the floor. The medical officer was a broad, unhurried Threll named Vask, who ran Ren through the standard pre-engagement panel, reflexes, cardiovascular baseline, a scan for anything that might turn a hard strike into something worse than intended. With the same brisk professional courtesy she'd have given any cadet before any sanctioned bout. Baseline's clean, Vask said, reviewing the display. Better than clean, honestly. Your resting cardiovascular numbers are the lowest I've logged all week, and I've logged 40 cadets. You understand you're about to walk onto a floor in front of the entire cohort. I understand that. Most cadets' numbers climb 10, 15% just from the anticipation, Vask said, not quite a question. I try not to give anticipation much room to work with, Ren said. It doesn't help. Whatever's going to happen out there is going to happen whether my heart rates up or not. Might as well save the energy. Vask studied her for a moment with the flat, professional curiosity of a medic who'd spent a career reading bodies for what they weren't saying out loud, then signed off on the clearance without further comment. Draxus's clearance, run in a separate room 20 minutes later, took longer, not because anything was wrong, but because his numbers, Ren learned secondhand from a duty nurse who mentioned it in passing without any particular discretion, had come in high enough that Vask had run the cardiovascular panel twice to be sure of the reading. By 1300 hours, the primary training hall had filled past anything Ren had seen there in 14 months. The padded floor at its center, a broad circle of matting, 30 meters across, marked with the same clean boundary lines used for every sparring bout on the station, looked, for the first time since Ren had walked past it as a first-term cadet still learning the layout of the wheel, genuinely small under the weight of everyone crowded around it. Tiered seating along 3 sides. A standing gallery along the 4th, packed shoulder to shoulder, species she recognized and a handful she still, after 14 months, had to consciously place. The review board's table sat at the circle's northern edge. Koleth Idren, the Threll captain, with the medical station a discreet distance beyond it, Vask and 2 assistants and a stretcher nobody wanted to think too hard about, standing ready. Rain found her in the staging corridor behind the hall, 10 minutes before the call. You look the same as you did in my office 6 days ago, he said. I mean that as a compliment. Most cadets I've seen through this door looked like a different person by fight time. I feel about the same, Ren said. That's the point, Colonel. Anything you need from me before you go out there? Ren thought about it for a moment. No, she said. You already gave it to me, smallest effective action. I've got the rest. Rain nodded once, and didn't say anything else, and didn't need to, and Ren walked past him toward the hall doors alone. The noise hit her first. 110 cadets and staff from 9 species, all their separate murmurs and clicks and hums and low percussive vocalizations folding together into a single restless wall of sound that dropped, almost instantly, the moment she stepped through the doors and onto the edge of the mat. Draxus was already there, on the opposite side of the circle, stripped down to a training wrap the same as her own. No padding. The terms of the article read into record 4 days ago, now sitting plainly visible on both their bodies. He was up close and unclothed of armor, exactly as large as Ren had always known him to be, and somehow larger still. Heavy through the shoulder and neck in the particular way of a species built for close, grappling combat. Scarred faintly along one forearm from some training incident years past. Standing with the coiled, deliberate stillness of a man who had spent 6 days telling himself a story about what was about to happen and had, in the last 10 minutes, run entirely out of ways to rehearse it further. Dean Kolith rose from the board's table, and the hall's remaining noise dropped away entirely. "This engagement proceeds under the terms entered into record 4 days ago," she said, her translated voice carrying clean and flat to every corner of the packed hall. "It will end on yield, on medical incapacity, or on my call, and on no other condition. Both combatants have been medically cleared. Both combatants have confirmed acceptance of the terms." Her 4 dark eyes moved from Draxus to Ren and back again. "Cadet Kell, Cadet Calder. Step to the mark." They stepped to the marks, 2 painted lines 3 meters apart, near the circle's center, and stood facing each other while Kolith ran through the last of the formal language. The words Ren would remember afterward mostly as texture rather than content, because her attention had already narrowed, the way it always narrowed before something that mattered, down to a single unhurried point. His stance, his weight, the very slight forward lean he was carrying in his shoulders that told her, more clearly than anything he'd said in 6 days, that he intended to close distance immediately and grapple, because grappling was where his mass advantage did the most work, and his instincts, entirely correctly, told him that a fight fought at range was a fight fought on terms he didn't fully understand. "Begin," Kolith said. Draxus moved on the word, fast for his size, closing the 3 meters between the marks in less than a second, both arms already reaching to close around her before she could set herself. And it was, Ren registered with the small clinical part of her mind that never quite stopped assessing even in the middle of things, a genuinely well-executed opening. Fast, committed. Exactly the kind of decisive first move that ended most bouts against most opponents. Before they'd finished registering, the engagement had started. She was not there when his arms closed. It wasn't a large movement. That was the part the gallery would spend the rest of the term trying to describe to each other and never quite managing, because there was nothing large to describe. A half step, a turn of the hips, a redistribution of weight so economical it barely registered as motion at all, and Draxus's grasping reach closed on empty air where she had been standing a fraction of a second before, and his own considerable forward momentum, no longer met by the resistance he'd built his whole approach around, carried him half a stride past where she now stood, slightly behind and to his left. He recovered faster than most cadets his size could have managed, spinning to reorient, already reaching again, and found her hand closed loosely around his extended wrist, not gripping hard, not twisting, just resting there, redirecting the angle of his own turn by a few degrees, enough that his second grasping reach missed as cleanly as his first. "You're fighting the fight you trained for," Ren said, quiet, not breathless, not urgent, the same flat, unhurried register she'd used on him in a classroom 9 days ago. "I'd stop doing that if I were you." Draxus didn't answer. He planted, reset his stance, and came again, lower this time, a shoulder driven in toward her center of mass, the kind of committed close-range strike meant to end a fight through sheer transferred force, the kind of strike that would have put most cadets on the mat regardless of skill, because physics did not care how skilled you were once 400 pounds of committed V-Horan muscle connected at full extension. It connected with nothing. Ren's weight had already shifted, a half-turn that put her outside his shoulder's line entirely, and her palm came up and against the side of his jaw as he passed. Not a strike. Nothing that would have registered on a force meter as anything more than a firm, deliberate touch, and used the last of his own forward momentum to guide his head a few degrees further than his balance wanted to follow. And Draxus Kell, for the first time in 6 days of obsessive, weighted, publicly performed preparation, hit the mat. It was not a hard fall. She had not thrown him. She had simply stopped resisting the trajectory he'd already committed to and let his own weight finish the sentence he'd started. And he went down onto one knee and one hand, catching himself, already pushing back up before the gallery had finished its first collective intake of breath. He came up angry, the first real crack in the composed, formal certainty he'd carried into the hall, and Ren registered it in the set of his shoulders, the slight widening of his stance, the shift from calculated aggression to something rower, less controlled in some part of her, watching it happen, thought of Sarek's words in the empty training hall 3 nights before. I think it is closer to his granduncle's argument given a body to stand against. The argument was losing. The body underneath it had started, for the first time, to feel it. "Stop," Ren said, still not raising her voice, still standing loose and unhurried 3 meters from where he'd fallen. "You've made your point twice already. There's no third version of this that ends differently." "There is," Draxus said, and came at her a third time, faster and less careful than either of the first 2 attempts, one massive arm already drawing back for a strike instead of a grapple, the shift in tactics of a man who had run out of patience with technique, and decided, in the space of a single heartbeat, that raw force was the only variable left untested. The strike, when it came, was fast enough that half the gallery would later swear they never actually saw Ren move to meet it. What they saw, what the sensor logs would later confirm, frame by frame, for a review board that watched the footage in silence 4 separate times before filing it, was Draxus's fist arriving at the space where her head had been a fraction of a second earlier, and Ren already inside the arc of his extended arm, one hand catching his wrist at the wrist, the other coming up and in against the joint of his elbow with a precise, economical pressure that had nothing showy in it at all. And Draxus Kell's own considerable strength, driven forward into a strike that had nowhere left to land, folding his own arm structure against itself. He went down a second time, harder than the first, a controlled collapse rather than a throw, his knees buckling under a joint lock that gave him exactly enough pain to register the danger and exactly no room to fight through it. And Ren went down with him, not releasing the hold, guiding him the last half meter to the mat with the same economy she'd shown in every motion since Kolith had said begin. Until he lay on his back with his arm extended and locked, and his shoulder pinned flat against the padding, entirely, completely immobilized, by a woman roughly 2/3 his mass who had not, in the whole of the engagement, raised her voice once. The hall had gone utterly silent. "Yield," Ren said, still quiet, still flat. "Kell." "Yield." Draxus's jaw was clenched, his whole body rigid against the hold, and for a long moment, 3 seconds, 4, an eternity in the packed silence of the hall. He didn't answer, and Ren didn't apply any further pressure, didn't twist the joint another degree to force the issue, simply held the position steady and waited, because that, too, was doctrine. You did not escalate past the minimum required to end the engagement, not even in the last 3 seconds of it, not even with the whole gallery watching and a Fleet Marshal's 9-year argument hanging in the silence of the hall. "Yield," Draxus said finally, the word coming out through his teeth, low and furious, and underneath the fury, something that sounded almost like relief. Ren released the hold instantly, the moment the syllable left his mouth, not a fraction of a second later, and stepped back and away, giving him room, and Vask was already moving across the mat with her 2 assistants, and Dean Kolith's voice cut across the hall, clear and final. "The engagement is ended. Cadet Kell has yielded. This matter is settled under Article 40, and may not be reopened by either party." Vask reached Draxus first, running a scanner along the length of his arm with brisk professional focus, and pronounced the joint strained but intact, no tear, no fracture, a result that would keep him out of the training hall for perhaps a week and nothing worse than that, which Ren noted distantly with something that was not quite relief and not quite anything else she had a ready name for. She had not wanted to break anything. She had wanted, specifically and only, to end the engagement in the smallest way that would actually end it, and the joint lock had done exactly that, and no more. Draxus sat up against Vask's mild protest, cradling the strained arm against his chest, and looked across the mat at Ren with an expression that had nothing formal left in it at all, raw, furious, humiliated in front of the entire cohort, and worse, in front of the granduncle whose 9-year argument he had just spent a lifetime absorbing and a single afternoon disproving in front of witnesses. "That was nothing," he said, loud enough to carry, his voice cracking slightly on the word. "You barely touched me. That is not an answer. That is a parlor trick." "It was the answer," Ren said, quiet, not moving from where she stood. "You asked what was behind the blank line. I showed you exactly what's behind it. You don't like the answer because it isn't the one you spent 6 days training to receive. That's not the same as it not being real." "Show me again," Draxus said, trying to push himself up despite Vask's hand on his shoulder. "Full engagement, no terms, no board right now." "The matter is settled." Kolith's voice cut across the hall, sharp now, all the formal patience gone from it. "You yielded, Cadet Kell. Article 40 forecloses a second engagement between the same parties permanently, and you know that, because you sat through the same reading of the terms she did 4 days ago. Sit down and let the medic finish her examination, or I will have you removed from this hall under guard." Draxus sat, shaking, and it was in the 3 or 4 seconds after that, the hall's tension beginning, finally, to loosen, the review board's attention shifting toward closing procedure. Ren already half-turned to step back off the mat that G.A. Trent moved. He was V. Horan, Cadet Trank, one of the 3 Draxus had sparred through in a single evening 6 days earlier, and he had spent the whole of the engagement standing at the edge of the gallery with his hands closed into fists at his sides, and something in him, the humiliation of watching his own cohort mate broken in under a minute in front of the entire wheel, or some older, less examined loyalty that had nothing to do with reason at all, simply gave way. He came off the gallery's edge in a single powerful surge. No announcement, no formal challenge, no warning at all. A straight, committed rush across the open mat toward Ren's exposed back, both hands already reaching, and half the hall's collective gasp arrived a beat too late to function as a warning, because by the time the sound had fully formed, it was already happening. Ren did not turn to look at him first. She heard him, the change in the floor's vibration under 200, and some pounds of committed V. Horan muscle covering 8 meters in under 2 seconds, the specific frequency of a body moving to hit rather than to stop. And she was already moving before her eyes confirmed what her ears had told her. A half-pivot that put her outside his line at the last possible instant, her hand closing on his extended forearm as he passed, and using his own momentum again. The same economical redirection she'd used on Draxus twice already, to carry him past her and down, face first, controlled, onto the padded mat, her knee coming to rest against the back of his shoulder with just enough weight to keep him there without doing any damage at all. The whole exchange had taken less time than it had taken the hall to finish gasping. "Don't," Ren said to G.A. Trent, still pinned, still struggling uselessly against a hold that gave him no leverage to work with. Her voice had not changed register at all, not louder, not colder, not more urgent than it had been telling Draxus to yield a minute before. "You're not part of this. This was never yours to finish." 2 security officers were already moving across the mat, and behind them, Ren registered at the edge of her vision, 2 more cadets shifting their weight forward off the gallery's edge. Not committed yet, not moving yet, but coiled, the posture of a crowd's mood tipping towards something the review board's authority alone might not be able to hold. Dean Coleth's voice cracked across the hall like a whip. All 8 limbs spread wide in a gesture that Wren didn't know the meaning of but understood instantly anyway. The universal grammar of asterisk do not move, any of you, or you will regret it. Enough. The translated word came out flat and enormous, filling the hall's every corner. This engagement is closed. Any cadet who sets foot on this mat without my explicit order will be facing me personally, and I promise every one of you, whatever Cadet Calder is capable of. I have run this academy for 11 years, and I am considerably less patient than she has been today. Security, secure Cadet G.A. Trent for formal charges. Everyone else, off the mat into the gallery now. The 2 coiled cadets at the gallery's edge subsided. The 2 security officers reached G.A. Trent and took him from Wren's controlled hold with a professional efficiency that suggested they, too, had trained for exactly this kind of moment and were grateful, this once, not to have needed anything more dramatic from their training than a clean handoff. Wren stepped back off the mat and let them work, and stood there in the sudden churning quiet of a hall that had just watched 2 separate demonstrations inside the space of 90 seconds, and did not look triumphant, and did not look shaken, and looked, if anything, faintly tired, the specific tiredness of someone who had done a job competently and would rather now be somewhere quieter. Fleet Marshal Threx Kell had not moved from his chair beside the board's table through the entire second incident. He sat very still, his scarred face unreadable, watching Wren with an intensity that had nothing left in it of the polite diplomatic distance he'd carried into the corridor conversation 4 hours earlier. Sarek reached Draxus's side before the medics could finish escorting him toward the infirmary corridor, crouching down beside him, saying something low that Wren couldn't hear across the width of the hall, and whatever it was, Draxus didn't answer it. He was staring instead at the spot on the mat where G.A. Trent had gone down, the same controlled, economical, almost gentle takedown that had happened to him twice already in the span of a single afternoon, and something in his expression had started, finally, to shift from fury into something else. Not acceptance, not yet, but the first raw edge of a man beginning to understand that the story he'd spent 6 days rehearsing had never once matched the thing that actually happened whenever it collided with reality. Dean Coleth descended from the board's table and crossed the mat toward Wren directly. Her mantle rippled in a way that Wren, after 14 months, had learned to read as something between professional composure and genuine, personal relief. "Are you hurt, Cadet Calder?" "No, Dean." "You are certain?" "I'm certain." Coleth studied her for a moment with all 4 dark eyes. "You could have done considerably more to Cadet G.A. Trent than you did," she said. "An unsanctioned attack from behind, on a padded floor, in the middle of my hall, with my own security still 4 meters away. Most combat doctrines I am aware of would not have faulted you for a decisive response." "He wasn't trying to kill me, Dean," Wren said. "He was embarrassed and angry, and he did something stupid because he didn't know what else to do with either of those feelings. That's not the same threat as somebody who means it. I don't answer both of those the same way. If I did, I'd be exactly the thing your marshal's been arguing about for 9 years, something that treats every provocation as an excuse for the maximum available response. That's not strength, Dean. That's just a shorter fuse with better aim." Coleth was quiet for a long moment, her small eyes moving across Wren's face with an attention that felt, for the first time in 14 months, less like an administrator assessing a cadet, and more like a person genuinely trying to understand another person. 11 years I have run this academy," she said finally, quietly, pitched for Wren alone rather than the recovering murmur of the hall around them. "I have seen a great many demonstrations of capability in this room. I confess I have never seen one quite like this. 2 engagements, one sanctioned and one not, ended with what I would estimate as the absolute minimum force required and not one measure more, delivered by a cadet whose own resting heart rate, I am told, barely moved through either of them. Her mantle rippled once more. "I begin to understand," Cadet Calder, "why your homeworld might prefer that number stay behind a blank line, not because there is nothing there. Because there is exactly the kind of nothing there that makes every other number in this register look like posturing by comparison." She turned and walked back toward the board's table to begin the formal closing of the hearing, and left Wren standing alone at the mat's edge, in the slow settling quiet of a hall that had, in the space of one afternoon, learned something about the redacted line in its textbook that no lecture, no counsel argument, and no 9 years of careful diplomatic sparring had ever managed to teach it. The formal closing of the hearing took another 20 minutes, most of it procedural, Kolith reading the engagement's result into the permanent record, confirming Draxus's medical status, confirming that Article 40's dispute was now, by charter, permanently settled and could not be reopened by either party under any circumstance. G.A. Trent's unsanctioned attack was logged as a separate matter entirely, referred to a full disciplinary board rather than the more limited Article 40 proceeding, and Kolith made a point, reading the referral into the record, of noting that an unprovoked assault on a cadet who had already demonstrated, twice within the hour, a capacity for restraint under direct physical threat would be weighed by the board with that restraint specifically in mind. A pointed sentence, Wren understood, aimed less at G.A. Trent's file than at the gallery still filing slowly out of the hall around them, a reminder that mercy shown was not the same as weakness proven, and that the board intended to treat it accordingly. Wren was released from the hall a little after 1500 hours, and found Fane waiting for her in the corridor outside, wings half-mantled, feathers still faintly ruffled with adrenaline she had clearly been carrying since the moment G.A. Trent broke from the gallery. "I watched the whole thing from the second tier," Fane said, falling into step beside her without preamble. "I have never in 14 months seen this station go that quiet, not during exam results, not during the supply shortage in the second term. I did not know a room full of 9 species could go quiet in the same way at the same moment." "How are you doing?" Wren asked, because Fane's voice still had an edge to it that hadn't been there before the challenge. "I am cataloging," Fane said, which was, Wren had learned over 14 months, Fane's particular way of saying she was not yet ready to say how she actually felt. "I will send my government a full report of the engagement, factual, unembellished, because that is my specialization and it is the honest thing to do. I expect it will travel considerably further than my usual reports typically travel." She glanced sideways. "You are aware, I assume, that half the cohort has already transmitted personal accounts to their own homeworlds. By tomorrow, this will not be a Threshold Academy story any longer. It will be a compact story." Wren was quiet for a moment, walking. "I know," she said finally, "I didn't want that. I don't think there was a version of today where I could have gotten what I actually wanted, Kel held accountable for grabbing my arm, and nothing bigger than that, without it becoming something bigger anyway. Some things don't stay small no matter how carefully you try to keep them that way. You do the smallest version of the job that's actually in front of you and let the rest sort itself out. That's the only part of it I ever had control over." Fane didn't say anything for a while and then, quietly, "Thank you for what you said to him in that alcove. I have not properly thanked you for that. I was frightened and you made it stop, and you did it without making it about yourself, and I do not think I have told you in the days since how much that mattered to me." "You don't need to thank me for that," Wren said. "That part wasn't a favor, that was just the job." "I know," Fane said. "That is rather the point of thanking you for it." They reached the mess hall junction, where their corridors would normally split, and Fane hesitated. "Will you eat with me?" she asked. "I do not particularly want to sit alone with everyone still talking about it. And I suspect, from the look of you, that you do not especially want to sit in the middle of everyone talking about it either." "I'd like that," Wren said, and they walked in together, and if the mess hall went quieter than usual when they crossed the floor, And if a dozen conversations paused and resumed in careful, overly casual tones, neither of them commented on it, and they ate in their usual corner, at their usual table, the way they had for 14 months, because some things, Wren had decided somewhere in the last hour, were worth protecting from becoming a bigger story than they needed to be, even when the rest of the day had already stopped being small. Fleet Marshal Threx Kell requested a private audience with Colonel Rain that evening in the Human Liaison office, and Rain, who had not expected the request and said so afterward more than once, with a note of genuine surprise in his voice, invited Wren to sit in on the grounds. He told her privately beforehand that whatever the Marshal wanted to say, he suspected it was meant for her more than for him. Threx Kell arrived without his formal harness, dressed instead in a plain gray field coat that stripped away most of the rank insignia that had marked him so clearly in the hearing chamber that morning, and he sat across from Rain's desk, with the slow, deliberate care of a very old soldier lowering himself into a chair that had seen better decades. "I have spent 9 years," he said without preamble, "building the most complete argument I know how to build, that your species rating is a diplomatic fiction. I have presented it to the full Compact Council 4 times. I have watched half the fleet command structure of 3 separate member worlds adjust their contingency doctrine around my argument, on the theory that a threat nobody can verify is a threat that should be discounted in proportion to its unwillingness to be verified." He was quiet for a moment. "I watched my grandnephew break himself against that argument today, in front of witnesses, in under a minute twice, by a woman who did not raise her voice a single time through either engagement." Marshal Rain started. "I am not finished, Colonel." Threx Kell's scarred jaw was set. "I do not enjoy admitting an error of this magnitude. I have built a career on the discipline of admitting error quickly and completely when the evidence demands it, and I intend to hold myself to my own standard, however much I would prefer not to. I will be filing an amendment to my counsel testimony. I will not name the number I still do not possess, because I still do not possess it, and I suspect I never will, and I have concluded, watching your cadet on that floor today, that the number was never actually the point." He looked at Wren directly for the first time since sitting down. "The point, I think, was always what she demonstrated instead of the number. Restraint under provocation so complete that it looked, to a room that had spent 9 years listening to me argue the opposite, almost like gentleness. And beneath the restraint, entirely undisguised, capability I have no doubt whatsoever could have ended both engagements in a manner considerably less recoverable than a strained arm and a bruised pride, had she judged that outcome necessary." "That's a generous read of an afternoon, Marshal," Wren said quietly. "It is an accurate one," Threx Kell said. "I built my career reading engagements for exactly this kind of information, Cadet. I did not misread it, and I do not believe you misread it either, when you chose the smaller outcome twice in a row with the whole of the Compact's opinion of your species riding on the choice. That is not luck. That is doctrine, deeply held, applied under exactly the kind of pressure that reveals whether a doctrine is real or merely rehearsed." He rose slowly, and the plain gray coat settled around him with none of the formal weight it had carried that morning. "My grandnephew will require some time to understand what he actually learned today, Cadet. I do not think he understands it yet himself. I watched his face in that hall, and it was not the face of a man who has been proven wrong. It was the face of a man who has been proven wrong faster than he had built any capacity to process. That will take him longer than an afternoon. I would ask, if it is within your capacity to extend it, that you have some patience with him while he catches up to what the rest of us watched happen in real time." Wren considered that for a moment. "I don't hold grudges easily, Marshal," she said. "I never did. He grabbed my arm and I ended that, and it's over. Whatever he does with the rest of it is his business to work through, not mine to manage for him. But I'll say this. If he comes back around ready to ask an honest question instead of demand a trophy, I'll answer it the same way I'd have answered it 9 days ago in that classroom, before any of this started. That offer was never withdrawn. He's the one who stopped hearing it as an offer. Threx Kell studied her for a long moment, and something in his old scarred face shifted. Not quite a smile, V-Horan faces weren't built for that kind of softness, but something adjacent to respect, hard-won and plainly, visibly costly to extend. I begin to understand, he said, why the number stays behind the line. He inclined his head to Rain and then, more formally, to Wren. Colonel, Cadet, I have a shuttle to catch and a testimony to amend, and I find for the first time in 9 years that I am not entirely certain what I am going to say when I stand up in front of the council to say it. I suspect that uncertainty is itself the most honest thing I have felt about your species rating since I first read the blank line. He left, and the office was quiet for a long moment after the door closed behind him. Well, Rain said finally, leaning back in his chair with something that might have been the beginning of a real smile. That's not a sentence I expected to hear out of Threx Kell in my lifetime. 9 years of council testimony, and you cracked it in an afternoon without laying a hand on him. I didn't crack anything, Colonel, Wren said. I ended 2 engagements as small as I could end them. Whatever he took from watching that, he took on his own. I don't get credit for a conclusion. Somebody else reached watching me do my job. No, Rain agreed, and this time the smile did arrive, small and dry and genuine. I don't imagine you'd take it even if I offered it to you on a platter. Go get some sleep, Wren. You've earned it, whether or not you'll admit that either. The disciplinary board convened on G.A. Trent's case 3 days later, and handed down a censure heavier than Wren had expected. A full-term suspension from combat electives, a formal reprimand entered permanently into his service record, and a mandatory series of sessions with the Academy's conduct review officer, that G.A. Trent, according to the corridor rumor mill that never quite stopped running. Attended with visible resentment for the first 2 weeks, and something closer to genuine reflection by the 6th. Draxus's arm healed inside 8 days, faster than Vask had initially projected, V-Horan physiology running hot and efficient through minor tissue, repair the way it ran hot and efficient through most things. He did not speak to Wren for the better part of 3 weeks after the hearing, not out of continued hostility. She gathered second-hand through Sarek, but out of something closer to genuine uncertainty about what there was left to say. Now that the argument he'd built 6 days of obsessive preparation around had ended so completely, and so quietly that he hadn't yet found the shape of a response to it. She saw him twice during those 3 weeks, at a distance, in the mess hall and once in the ring corridor, and both times he inclined his head to her. The same small formal V-Horan gesture Sarek had used weeks before, an acknowledgement without the weight of a full conversation behind it yet, and both times she returned it, and neither of them said anything, and the whole exchange took less time than it took to walk past each other. The story, as Fane had predicted, did not stay a Threshold Academy story. Within a week it had traveled, in the particular garbled, half-accurate way stories travel through 110 cadets' personal correspondence to 110 separate homeworlds, to council chambers and fleet briefing rooms and academy lecture halls across a dozen member systems. And Wren heard from Rain, who heard it from channels he didn't fully explain, that at least 3 separate compact fleets had quietly revised their contingency doctrine for encountering unknown hostiles in the weeks that followed. Not dramatically, not with any public announcement, just a subtle downward adjustment in the confidence with which those doctrines assumed an unfamiliar opponent's true capability could be read from its outward bearing. Fleet Marshal Threx Kell's amended council testimony, when it was finally delivered, ran considerably shorter than his previous 4 appearances on the subject. Rain showed her the transcript weeks later, forwarded through some liaison channel with a note attached that just said, "Thought you'd want to see this." It read, in its entirety, close enough to memory that Ren could recite the closing line back to Rain without looking at the page again. I withdraw my prior characterization of the human threat rating as unverified diplomatic posturing. I do not offer a revised number, because I do not possess one, and I have concluded, after considerable reflection, that the absence of a number may itself be the most honest disclosure the Compact has ever received on the subject. I recommend the Council proceed accordingly. It was not, Ren thought, reading it, a dramatic sentence. It did not ring with the kind of language that made history texts. It was a tired old soldier admitting, in the driest possible register, that he had been wrong for 9 years, and doing it without excuse or embellishment, which struck her, on balance, as exactly the kind of ending that argument had deserved. Life at Threshold Academy, in the way of institutions built around 110 young officers with coursework to finish and postings to earn, resumed its ordinary rhythm faster than Ren had expected. The lecture halls filled and emptied on schedule. The training rotations ran their normal cycles. Applied Threat Doctrine, the Ledger class, reconvened the following week with instructor Idren picking up precisely where the syllabus had left off, on the unit covering first contact response protocols, as though the intervening 9 days had been an ordinary academic recess, rather than the single most talked-about event Corona Station had hosted in 6 years. Draxus came back to that classroom on the 4th week after the hearing, his arm fully healed. His seat too rose back from where it had been before, and for the first 3 sessions he said nothing at all, took careful notes, and left the moment class ended without lingering the way he once had to argue a point past the bell. On the 4th session, Instructor Idren opened the floor for questions on a unit covering threat rating methodology across species with historically opaque military doctrine, and Draxus raised his hand. Ren, 2 seats over, felt the room's attention shift the way it always shifted now whenever he spoke, a residual wariness that hadn't fully faded, and watched him for a moment before Idren called on him. Cadet Kell. Draxus was quiet for a second, his taloned hands folded on the desk in front of him, and when he spoke his voice carried none of the formal, challenging edge it had carried 9 weeks earlier. It carried something closer to plain, careful honesty. "I have a question," he said, "not a challenge. An actual question, if the instructor and the class will permit the distinction, since I understand I have not always been careful about it." A faint ripple moved through the room, not laughter exactly, but something adjacent to it, the particular relief of a room recognizing a genuine attempt at repair. When a species chooses to withhold its own threat rating rather than have the Compact assign one, is that decision typically driven by strategic caution, or is it driven by something else? I ask because I spent a great deal of time, this term assuming it could only be the first. I no longer think that is a complete answer, and I would like to understand the rest of it, if someone in this room is willing to explain it to me properly, since I did not ask properly the first time. Idren's crest feathers settled, something in her posture easing for the first time in 9 weeks. "That's a question for Cadet Calder, I think," she said. "If she's willing to answer it." Every head in the room turned, and Ren felt the old familiar weight of it. 110 cadets waiting to see what happened next, and found, this time, that it didn't sit on her the way it had 9 weeks before. Because this time the question underneath the question was an actual question, asked plainly, by someone who had finally run out of certainty and started, instead, to genuinely want to know. "It's both," Ren said. "Strategic caution's part of it. You don't hand a number to people you've only known for a few decades when that number could get used against you by the next fleet that decides it likes the math. But it's not only that." She considered how to say the rest of it, the part she'd spent 14 months not quite finding an audience ready to hear. "There's a version of this where Earth publishes a rating, and every cadet in this cohort spends their whole term reading me through that number instead of reading me at all, deciding what I'm capable of, what I'm likely to do, how much room to give me, All of it filtered through a figure on a page instead of through anything I actually said or did. A number like that doesn't describe a person, Kel. It replaces one. I think that's the real reason the line stays blank, not because there's nothing behind it. Because whatever's behind it, my homeworld decided a long time ago that it would rather be known through what its people actually do than through a rating that would let everyone stop looking. The room was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of 110 young officers turning something over that none of them had expected to be handed so plainly. "That is a more complicated answer than I was prepared for," Draxus said finally, and there was something almost rueful in it, the first hint of dry humor Wren had ever heard from him. "I confess I preferred the version where you were simply hiding a number." "Most people do," Wren said. "Numbers are easier than people." "That's true for every species in this room, not just yours." Idren, watching the exchange with the careful attentiveness of an instructor recognizing a teaching moment better than anything on her lesson plan, let the silence sit a beat longer before moving the class on. And if anyone in the room noticed that Draxus Kell spent the rest of the session taking notes with an attention he had never once shown the subject before, in 9 weeks of prior lectures, nobody said anything about it, and the ordinary business of the class resumed around them. The way ordinary business always resumed, eventually, around even the loudest things that happened inside a room. Outside class, in the weeks that followed, Draxus did not become a friend. Exactly the distance between what had happened in that hall and anything resembling ease was too wide to close entirely, and Wren didn't push it, and neither, to his credit, did he, but he stopped avoiding the training hall when she was in it. And twice, near the end of the term, he asked, formally and carefully, whether she'd be willing to run a technical drill with him. Not a bout, not a contest. Just the slow, patient work of learning something he genuinely wanted to understand, since the first time he'd found himself on his back on a padded floor wondering how he'd gotten there. She said yes both times, and taught him what she could about weight and leverage and the difference between force and control, and he was, she found, a careful and genuinely attentive student once the certainty had finally been knocked loose from him. And something in that slow, unglamorous rebuilding felt, to Wren, like a better ending to the whole business than any of the versions the rest of the station had spent 9 weeks telling each other. Fane's report to her government, when it was finally filed, ran to 11 pages of careful, factual, entirely unembellished documentation, and generated, according to Fane herself, considerably more attention from the Melara Diplomatic Corps than any report she'd filed in her career, none of which she found especially comfortable, and all of which she bore with the same quiet, patient competence she brought to everything. "They want me to specialize in human liaison work after graduation," she told Wren, over their usual corner table, some 6 weeks after the hearing. "I am not certain how I feel about that. I became a records cataloger because I like documents that stay still and let themselves be read carefully. You are not a document that stays still, Wren. None of this has stayed still since the day Kell put his hand on your wrist." "You don't have to take the posting if you don't want it," Wren said. "I know." Fane considered her tray for a moment. "I think I might take it anyway. I have spent 14 months watching how your species actually moves through the world up close, in a way most of the compact never gets to see past the redacted line and the rumors. I find I would rather be the one writing the careful, factual account than leave that job to people who only ever saw the story secondhand, and added 3 fingers and a broken hand to it before it reached the next system over. Wren smiled at that, small and genuine. "That's a good reason," she said. "Better than most reasons people pick a posting for." The term ended, eventually, the way terms always ended: exams, evaluations, a graduation ceremony for the senior cohort that Wren watched from the crowd rather than the stage, since she still had 2 terms left before her own would come. Colonel Rain retired 8 months later, his replacement already trained and waiting, And the last thing he told Ren before he shipped out on the transport back toward a homeworld he'd been away from for 11 years was not advice, for once, but something closer to an observation. "You know what the strangest part of this whole business was for me," he said, standing at the departure gate with his kit bag over one shoulder, and the particular unhurried calm of a man finally allowed to stop being responsible for other people's crises. "It wasn't the fight, wasn't even the marshal walking back 9 years of testimony. It was watching 110 cadets from 9 species spend a whole term learning the same lesson search and rescue teams back home learn in their first year on the job, and never once needing the word for it, because you never gave them the word. You just did the job the same way every time, small as it would go, and let them work out on their own what that meant about the rest of us." He shook her hand, a firm, dry old soldier's grip. "That's a harder thing to teach than most people realize," Cadet Calder. "Don't lose the habit of it once you've got real rank to hide behind." "I won't, Colonel." "No," Rain said, with the small, dry, almost smile she'd come to know well over 14 months. "I don't imagine you will." The end-of-term reception, held in the observation ring 2 weeks before graduation, was the kind of event Ren had learned to tolerate rather than enjoy. Soft lighting, careful diplomatic small talk, a rotating guest list of visiting dignitaries and fleet liaisons who used the occasion to size up the coming year's graduating cohort before the compact's various services made their recruitment offers. She had gone every year because attendance was, functionally, mandatory for exchange cadets, and had spent every prior year finding the quietest corner of the room and staying in it until the appropriate interval had passed. This year, for the first time, people found her instead. Most of the attention was mild, a Threll Fleet liaison who wanted her opinion on close-quarters doctrine revisions, a pair of junior Scarn officers who asked careful, respectful questions about search and rescue protocol back on Earth, a Melara records administrator who spent 10 minutes thanking her, with slightly excessive earnestness, for whatever role she'd played in Fane's now considerable career prospects. Ren answered what she could, deflected the rest with the same easy, unbothered patience she brought to everything, and was working her way steadily toward the exit when a voice behind her, pitched loud enough to be heard across half the room, stopped her. "So this is the famous cadet." The speaker was Cathari, a species Ren had encountered only twice before at Threshold, tall and narrow-boned with pale, faintly luminous skin, and a reputation, well earned as far as she could tell, for a kind of brittle intellectual arrogance that treated most physical confrontation as beneath serious consideration. He wore the formal sash of a visiting trade delegation, not academy dress, and held a drink in one long-fingered hand with the loose, unsteady confidence of someone several rounds into an evening. He considered himself too important to need to pace. "I've heard the story 4 different ways," he said, stepping closer, close enough that the small cluster of cadets around Ren instinctively widened their circle. "A duel, a brawl, a demonstration staged for the marshal's benefit. Half the delegation I'm attached to thinks it's propaganda dressed up as an incident report, a controlled theater piece your liaison office arranged to reinforce the redacted rating right when the council was getting close to voting it down entirely. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? 9 years of argument, and then, right as the vote approaches, a very dramatic, very public demonstration falls into everyone's lap." "It wasn't staged," Ren said, mild, unbothered. "But I understand why that's an easier story to hold onto than the alternative." "Is it?" The Cathari's pale eyes glittered with the particular brightness of a man enjoying an audience more than he was tracking the actual conversation. "Prove it, then. Right here. No board, no medic, no 6 days of ceremony to build the drama. Just you and me, and whatever it is you did to that V-Horan boy that's got the whole station whispering." A ripple of unease moved through the small crowd around them. Several cadets who'd witnessed the hearing weeks earlier exchanging glances. A Threll liaison officer starting to step forward with the beginnings of an intervention already forming on her face. Wren didn't move. She looked at the Cathari for a moment, taking in the loose stance, the drink still in hand, the faint unsteadiness in his footing that had nothing to do with any training and everything to do with several rounds of something considerably stronger than the reception's sparkling water. "No," she said. He blinked, thrown, clearly having expected either an escalation or a retreat, and got neither. "No. You want a story to tell your delegation," Wren said. "Something you were there for, something that lets you claim a piece of whatever happened in that hall 3 weeks ago without doing the work of actually understanding it. I'm not interested in giving you material for that story. And you're not actually issuing a challenge, ambassador, you're performing one, for this room, because you've had enough to drink that it seemed like a good idea a few minutes ago, and now you don't know how to stop without looking like you backed down. I'd like to help you stop without looking like you backed down. That's the only thing on offer here tonight." The room around them had gone quiet in the particular, alert way it had gone quiet in the training hall weeks before, dozens of conversations pausing mid-sentence to track what might happen next. "You're refusing," the Cathari said, and there was an edge of genuine anger creeping into it now, the bright, brittle anger of a man who had walked into a confrontation expecting an easy win and found instead that the ground had simply declined to be where he'd assumed it would be. "I'm declining a performance," Wren said. "There's a difference, same as there was a difference 9 weeks ago, and I think if you're sober enough to remember this conversation tomorrow, you'll be glad I saw it and you didn't." She held his gaze calm, entirely unhurried, and let a beat of silence sit before she spoke again, because she had learned, across 14 months and one very long term, that silence did more work than volume ever did. "If your delegation genuinely wants to understand what happened in that hall, I'll answer any question they send through proper channels, honestly, in as much detail as I'm cleared to give. That offer's real. What you're doing right now isn't a question. It's a show, and I don't put mine on for an audience that's already decided what they want the ending to be." For a long moment the Cathari ambassador stood there, drink still in hand, the whole weight of the reception's attention balanced on whatever he said next, and Wren watched something shift behind his pale, glittering eyes, not quite the same recognition she'd watched cross Draxus Kell's face on a padded floor weeks earlier. Softer, smaller, but adjacent to it. The particular deflation of a man realizing in real time that the confrontation he'd started had already ended, cleanly, without ever actually beginning, and that the only choice left to him was how gracefully he chose to accept that. "Perhaps," he said finally, and there was something almost brittle in the careful, deliberate way he set his glass down on a passing server's tray. "Perhaps I have had more of the sparkling reduction than was wise for this conversation. I withdraw the remark, Cadet. It was beneath the office I'm meant to represent here." He inclined his head, a stiff, unpracticed approximation of a formal V-Horan gesture that looked, on his narrow Cathari frame, faintly ridiculous, and Wren appreciated the attempt anyway, because it cost him something to make it in front of a room that had just watched him fail to bait her into anything at all. "Apology accepted," Wren said. "Go get some water, Ambassador. The reception's got another 2 hours in it, and you'll want to remember the rest of it clearly." He left, somewhat unsteadily, toward the refreshment table, and the room's held breath released in a slow exhale of restarted conversation, and the Threll liaison officer who'd started to intervene caught Wren's eye across the gap and gave her a small, grateful nod that needed no translation at all. Sarek, who had watched the whole exchange from a few paces back, crossed to where Wren stood once the crowd had thinned back to its ordinary reception murmur. "That was well done," he said, "better than well done. Draxus needed a floor and a board and 6 days of ceremony to learn what you just taught that man in under a minute. with considerably less physical evidence to show for it. He wasn't actually a threat, Ren said. Just embarrassed and drunk and looking for a story. Different problem than Draxus had, different solution. I begin to see, Sarek said, with the same careful, considering tone he'd used weeks earlier in an empty training hall, that there may be a great many different solutions in your particular doctrine, Cadet Calder, and that the fight on that mat was never actually the interesting part of it. The interesting part was watching you decide, over and over, exactly how much of what you're capable of a given moment actually calls for. I don't think most officers I've trained beside, of any species, could hold that line as consistently as you seem to. I don't always get it right, Ren said. I just try to get it right more often than I get it wrong. That's the whole of the doctrine, honestly. It's not as impressive as everyone keeps deciding it is. Sarek studied her for a moment, and something in his broad, quiet Threll face settled into an expression Ren had learned, by now, to read as genuine respect rather than the wary, cataloging caution. Most of the cohort had extended her since the hearing. I think, he said, that is precisely why it works. Graduation, 2 weeks later, was a smaller affair than Ren had expected. A formal hall, the senior cohort in dress uniform, families who could afford the transit standing in the gallery, a long, careful ceremony that moved species by species through commissioning oaths spoken in 9 different languages, and translated in real time into a shared trade tongue that stitched the whole disparate proceeding into something that almost briefly felt like a single unified thing. Ren still had 2 terms left before her own commissioning, and stood in the junior gallery with the rest of her cohort, watching the senior class file across the stage. Sarek crossed it near the middle of the alphabet, and inclined his head toward the junior gallery as he passed, a small private acknowledgement that Ren returned without needing to explain to anyone beside her why. Draxus crossed it near the end, tall and steady in V-Horan dress plate, and paused for just a moment at the edge of the stage to find her face in the crowd, and Ren met his eyes, and inclined her head, the same small formal gesture they'd exchanged in corridors for weeks now, and Draxus returned it with something that had, finally, real warmth underneath the formality, before he moved on to accept his commission and take his place among the newly graduated. Fane found her afterward in the crowded reception hall, dressed in Melara formal feathering that Ren had never seen her wear before, bright ceremonial down catching the light in a way that made her look, for once, like exactly what she was, a bright, careful young officer about to step into a career that would matter, in ways neither of them could fully map yet, to the whole shape of how the compact understood the species neither of them had expected, 14 months ago, to end up defending to a marshal, an ambassador, and a hall full of witnesses. They've confirmed the posting, Fane said, a little breathless with it. Human liaison specialist attached to the Joint Fleet Coordination Office. I start in 6 weeks. That's good work, Fane. You earned it. I earned the paperwork, Fane said. You're the one who gave me something worth writing 11 honest pages about. She hesitated, and then in the careful, considered way she chose her important sentences. I do not think I would have known how to write that report if I had not spent 14 months eating lunch with you first, Ren. Before any of it. Before the hearing, before the hall, before the marshal changed his testimony. I think the report was only ever honest because I already knew you, ordinarily, as a person who ate lunch across from me and asked how my coursework was going, long before I knew you as whatever the rest of the station has decided to call you now. Ren considered that for a moment, the reception noise rising and falling around them, the whole bright, complicated architecture of 9 species learning, slowly and imperfectly, to trust each other with something as fragile as a shared classroom. That's the part I'd want people to remember if any of them remember anything, she said. Not the hall, this. Lunch most days, same table, nothing dramatic about it at all. That's most of what being anyone actually is, Fane. The hall was just one afternoon. This was 14 months. Fane smiled, small and genuine, and reached out with one careful hand to press briefly against Ren's arm. Not the wrist, Ren noted, distantly, with something that might have been quiet gratitude for the specificity of the gesture, and said nothing further because nothing further needed saying, and the two of them stood together in the crowded hall for a while longer, watching a graduating class step, one commission at a time, out into a compact that had spent 14 months learning something about a redacted line in a textbook that no council testimony, no fleet doctrine revision, and no 9 years of careful diplomatic argument had ever managed to teach it half so well. Ren's own commissioning came 2 terms later, in the same formal hall, under the same careful translated ceremony, and if anyone in the gallery expected some grander marking of the occasion, some acknowledgement from the stage of the cadet whose name had traveled through a dozen fleet briefing rooms 2 years before, Dean Coleth gave them none of it. She read Ren's name in its proper alphabetical place among 40 other graduating cadets, administered the same oath in the same unhurried cadence she'd administered to every cadet before her, and moved on to the next name without pause, and Ren was, afterward, more grateful for that ordinary treatment than she would have been for any speech. She found Coleth in the administrative corridor an hour later, between receptions, and thanked her for it directly. "You're welcome," Coleth said, her mantle rippling with something that might have been amusement. "I confess it was a deliberate choice, Cadet Commander, I suppose I should say now. I have watched a great many officers of a great many species pass through this academy in 11 years, and the ones who wear a reputation lightly are, without exception, the ones who earned it honestly in the first place. I did not think you would want the stage to make more of it than you had already made of it yourself, on a padded floor, in front of witnesses, without asking my permission first. I appreciate that, Dean. I have one more thing for you before you ship out." Coleth reached into a fold of her formal wrap and produced a small data chip, unmarked. "Fleet Marshal Kell asked that this reach you personally, rather than through official channels. I have not reviewed its contents. I trust you not to make me regret extending that courtesy." Ren took it, turned it over once in her palm, and slipped it into her kit without opening it there in the corridor, because whatever it held felt, instinctively, like something that deserved privacy rather than an audience. She reviewed it that evening, alone in her quarters, packed and mostly emptied ahead of the transport that would carry her out to her first posting the following morning. It was not a long message. Threx Kell's scarred, weathered face filled the small display, recorded, she guessed from the framing, somewhere aboard a fleet vessel rather than in any formal office. "Commander Calder," he said, and the title spoken by him still carried a faint, careful weight, like a man testing whether a word fit as well as he'd hoped it would. "I do not make a habit of sending personal messages to junior officers I have met exactly twice. I am making an exception because I find, 2 years on, that I still think about that hall more often than I expected to, and I wanted you to know why, since I doubt anyone else has told you plainly. I built a career on the belief that certainty was a discipline, that a good officer arrived at conclusions through evidence, tested them rigorously, and held them without flinching once they were confirmed. I still believe that. What you taught me on that floor was that I had mistaken the shape of certainty for its substance. I was certain about your species because I had built an elegant, defensible argument and mistaken its elegance for its truth. You were certain about nothing except what the next 30 seconds required of you, and you were right every single time, because your certainty wasn't built on an argument at all. It was built on practice and restraint, and the plain, unglamorous discipline of doing the smallest necessary thing correctly, over and over, until it no longer required thought. I do not know what your career will hold, Commander. I suspect, given what I have seen, that it will hold a great deal. I wanted you to know, before you shipped out to find out, that somewhere in this compact there is an old marshal who spent 9 years building the wrong argument, and who is grateful, more than his testimony to the council ever properly conveyed, that a 22-year-old cadet took the time to show him the right one instead of simply proving him wrong and walking away. That is not a small thing to have done. I hope you carry the knowledge of it as lightly as you have carried everything else. The recording ended. Ren sat with it for a long moment in the mostly empty quarters, the last of her belongings packed into a single kit bag by the door, and then closed the display and set it aside, and did not watch it again, because she understood, the way she understood most things, that some messages were meant to be received once fully, and then carried forward quietly rather than returned to. The transport left at 0600 the following morning. Fane came to see her off at the departure gate, dressed now in the plain working uniform of a Joint Fleet Liaison Specialist rather than the ceremonial feathering of graduation night, and the two of them stood together for a few minutes in the quiet pre-dawn bustle of the departure ring, watching ground crews cycle cargo through the transport's loading bay. "Write to me," Fane said. "Actual letters, not just the standard service correspondence. I want to know how the posting goes. I want to know if you find another Draxus Kell out there, and whether you handle him the same way." "I'll write," Ren said, "and I hope I don't find another one." Once was plenty of excitement for a career. "I do not believe that for a moment," Fane said, with the small dry humor she'd grown into over 2 years, "but I appreciate the sentiment." She reached out and pressed her hand briefly against Ren's forearm, the same small, deliberate gesture from graduation night. "Safe travels, Commander Calder." "Safe travels, Specialist Corps." The transport carried Ren out past Corona Station's slow-turning wheel, past the neutral world's daylit ocean curve, out toward the jump point where a compact patrol frigate waited to carry her onward to her first posting. A joint human compact rapid response unit, tasked, appropriately enough, with exactly the kind of search and rescue and first contact stabilization work she'd trained 4 years for before Threshold Academy had ever entered her life at all. She thought, watching the station recede through the small viewport beside her seat, about the classroom 9 weeks into her first term at Threshold, and the quiet, unhurried moment of turning her wrist against a grip that had expected resistance and found none instead. She thought about the padded floor, and the joint lock, and the word *yield arriving through gritted teeth. She thought about Threx Kell's scarred face on a data chip, admitting, plainly and without excuse, that he had spent 9 years building the wrong kind of certainty. None of it, she reflected, had ever actually been about proving anything to anyone. It had only ever been about doing the job in front of her, as small as the job would go, and letting whatever conclusions people wanted to draw from that be theirs to draw rather than hers to manage. That was the whole of the doctrine. It had been the whole of the doctrine long before Threshold Academy, long before the blank line in a textbook had ever become a thing 110 cadets from 9 species argued about in a training hall, and it would go on being the whole of the doctrine long after this posting ended and the next one began, wherever that turned out to be. The frigate's jump klaxon sounded, distant and muffled through the transport's hull, and Ren closed her eyes for the transition, unhurried, unbothered, already turning her attention forward to whatever the next assignment actually required of her rather than to any story that might get told about it afterward, because that, in the end, was the only version of the answer that had ever mattered. Not a number, not a rating. Not a line in a register that 9 species had spent decades arguing over without ever once thinking, to simply watch what the quiet ones actually did. They would learn it the same way Draxus Kell had learned it, and the marshal, and the ambassador with the unsteady drink, and Fane on a bad afternoon in an empty alcove. Not from a file, and not from a redacted line, but from watching once closely what a calm person did with her hands when the room finally asked her to show them. 6 weeks into that first posting, the doctrine got its next real test, and it had nothing to do with a challenge, a hearing, or 110 cadets waiting to see what she'd do. Her unit answered a distress call from a mining survey team on a moon 3 jumps out from the nearest compact way station. A rockfall in an unstable tunnel network. 4 surveyors trapped behind a collapse. Atmosphere failing in the sealed section faster than the moon's thin, poisonous exterior air could be allowed to replace it. 2 of the surveyors were compact nationals. Cephalopod engineers from a world Wren had never set foot on. The other 2 were human contractors, part of the same joint venture that had put the survey team out there in the first place. The Rapid Response Unit's actual rescue specialist, a broad-shouldered Thrall sergeant named Voss, was 3 tunnels deep running triage on a structural collapse when the secondary shaft gave way behind him. And it was Wren, newly commissioned, 4 weeks into her first field posting, who was standing nearest the breach when the call came through that the sergeant was cut off, his own air reserve reading 40 minutes and dropping. And the only clear path back to him ran through a tunnel section the survey team's own engineers had already flagged as unsound. She did not hesitate over the decision the way the mining foreman, watching from the surface command tent, clearly expected her to. "I need the structural readout," she said, already pulling her own gear on voice level, unhurried, the same flat comm register she'd used on a padded floor 2 years earlier. "And I need someone who's actually walked that tunnel to tell me where the load's bearing, not where the diagram says it should be bearing." Diagrams are wrong more often than the people who have actually stood in the room. The foreman, a weathered human contractor named Isset who had clearly expected panic, or at minimum urgency loud enough to match the situation, gave her the readout instead, and walked her through the tunnel's actual behavior over the 2 months the survey had been running, and Wren listened to every word of it with the same unhurried attention she'd once given a threat doctrine lecture, before she went into the breach alone. Because a second body in that tunnel doubled the load risk without meaningfully improving the odds of reaching Voss before his air ran out, and the math worked coldly and quickly in her head, said one careful person moved faster and safer than 2 anxious ones. She reached Voss with 11 minutes of his reserve left, found him pinned at the shoulder under a support strut that had partially given, not crushed, not bleeding out, but genuinely stuck in a way his own considerable strength wasn't shifting, and she did not waste any of the 11 minutes on reassurance he didn't need or effort that wouldn't work. She read the strut's angle, found the single point where a controlled application of leverage would shift it without bringing down the rest of the ceiling, and worked it free with 4 careful movements that cost her. She noted afterward with the same clinical distance she'd applied to everything else, a torn shoulder muscle she didn't mention to anyone until the mission debrief 3 days later. They came out of the tunnel together with 6 minutes of Voss's reserve to spare, and the survey team's own trapped surveyors reached 20 minutes later through the original, more stable route. Once the rest of the unit had cleared the primary collapse, came out alive as well, all 4 of them, human and compact national both, because the mining foreman had given the rescue team an honest readout instead of a defensive one. And because a newly commissioned officer had trusted a stranger's field knowledge over a diagram, and because none of the actual difficult work had required anything louder than careful attention and 4 correctly executed movements under genuine time pressure. Sergeant Voss, once the medics had cleared him, found her afterward, in the staging tent, arm in a temporary sling she'd finally admitted to needing. "Command's calling it a clean extraction," he said. "I've read the after-action summary you filed. 4 sentences, Commander. I nearly died in that tunnel and you wrote it up in 4 sentences." "That's what happened," Wren said. "Structural failure, isolated the load point, applied leverage, extracted. 4 sentences covers it. I don't think it needs to be longer to be accurate." Voss studied her for a long moment, the particular careful, assessing look she'd gotten used to receiving from officers who just watched her work for the first time. "I heard a story about you before this posting," he said. "Something about an academy, a challenge, A V-Horan cadet who grabbed the wrong arm. Half my old unit swore it was exaggerated past recognition. I told them I'd reserve judgment until I saw you work myself. And I think, Voss said, whatever they told you happened in that hall, it probably happened exactly the way you'd have written it up. 4 sentences, no more than the situation required. He extended his good hand and she shook it, careful of her own shoulder. Good to serve with you, Commander. Good to serve with you, Sergeant. The unit shipped out 3 days later, onto the next posting, the next unmapped stretch of the Joint Fleet's rotation. And Wren carried the small, quiet satisfaction of the extraction with her the way she carried most things, without ceremony, without needing anyone else to confirm it had mattered, filed away alongside a padded floor on Corona Station, and a data chip she'd watched exactly once, and an old marshal's tired, honest voice admitting he'd built the wrong argument for 9 careful years. The doctrine held, it had always held. It would keep holding, she suspected, for as long as she kept doing the smallest necessary thing correctly, and letting the rest of the room draw its own conclusions from that. No number, no rating, no line in any register anywhere ever quite managing to say it as plainly as 4 correctly executed movements in a collapsing tunnel, or a wrist turned quietly against a grip that had expected resistance, and found, instead, only the calm, unhurried certainty of someone who had never once needed to raise her voice to be believed. She wrote to Fane that same week, from the transport carrying the unit onward, a short message tucked between mission logs and equipment requisitions. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would read, to anyone else, as more than routine correspondence between 2 friends scattered across a compact that was slowly, unevenly, learning to trust each other with more than paperwork. 6 weeks in, she wrote, first real extraction yesterday, torn shoulder, nothing serious. 4 surveyors home who wouldn't have been otherwise, and a sergeant who's decided the academy rumors were probably accurate after all, which I suppose is its own kind of report filed on my behalf. I told him 4 sentences covered it. He didn't believe me. I think that's becoming a pattern. How's the liaison posting? Tell me something ordinary. I could use ordinary about now, not because anything's gone wrong, only because I've noticed the extraordinary stuff tends to crowd out the ordinary in everyone else's version of events, and I'd rather hear about your actual days than the shape they get turned into once they've traveled a few systems. Fane's reply reached her 3 weeks later, delayed by the transport's own jump schedule, longer than Wren had expected and warmer. Two full pages about the liaison office's slow, unglamorous work of translating fleet doctrine documents between 11 languages. A running complaint about a colleague who insisted on filing reports in the passive voice. A small, proud paragraph about a junior officer she'd started mentoring who reminded her, she said, of exactly the kind of careful, patient competence she'd learned to recognize from watching someone else eat lunch across from her for 14 months before either of them knew what any of it would come to mean. Ordinary, Fane had written near the end, as requested. I confess I like it better than the alternative to, Wren, whatever the rest of the compact keeps insisting on making of both of us. I hope your shoulder heals cleanly. I hope the next 6 weeks are as unremarkable as this letter. Write again when you can. I will keep filing my careful, honest reports, and you will keep doing the smallest necessary thing correctly in whatever tunnel or hall or reception finds you next. And between the 2 of us, I suspect that is closer to the truth of what your homeworld actually is than anything either the marshal or the ambassador ever managed to argue in a council chamber. Wren read it twice, in the quiet of her bunk, somewhere between one jump point and the next, and then filed it away with the others. The marshal's message, the mission logs, the small accumulating record of a career that had never once needed a number behind a blank line to mean something to the people who'd actually stood close enough to watch it work. A third message reached her that same cycle, routed through a slower, less direct channel than Fane's. A V-Horan fleet correspondent stamp on the header. No rank insignia attached, just a name. Draxus had been commissioned 6 months behind his own cohort, held back a term by the disciplinary weight of the hearing, and he had never once, in all the time since, sent her anything beyond the small formal nod they still traded whenever their paths happened to cross. The message was short. Vhoran correspondence, she'd learned from Sarek once, ran spare by custom, a species that distrusted excess words the same way it distrusted excess motion, and valued a sentence in proportion to how much of it had been earned rather than simply composed. Commander Calder, I am told you extracted a trapped sergeant from a collapsing tunnel 6 weeks into your first posting, and that you filed the action in 4 sentences. I found this easier to believe than I once would have. I am attached now to a Border Patrol Wing 3 systems from where you serve. I do not expect this will ever place us in the same room again, and I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I regret that. I have thought a great deal, these past 2 years, about the difference between the fight I believed I was owed and the one you actually gave me. I built the first one out of 9 years of my granduncle's testimony and called it my own conviction, and I did not understand, until I was on my back on that mat with my own arm folded against itself, how little of it had ever actually been mine. You did not defeat an argument that day, Commander. You defeated an inheritance I had never once examined closely enough to know it wasn't load-bearing. I am grateful for that, though I did not have the grace to say so at the time, and I have not had a clean occasion to say it since. I am training a junior cadet now, in my own wing, Vhoran, proud, certain of a great many things she has not yet tested against anyone who could actually test them. I find myself, more often than I expected, telling her some version of what you told me once in a corridor, before any of this started. That an answer and a story are not the same thing, and that most of what looks like strength is only ever the louder of the two. I do not know if she is hearing it any better than I did. I intend to keep saying it regardless. Serve well, Commander. I suspect you will, whether or not the rest of the compact ever finds the right number to put behind it. Ren read that one only once, and sat with it a long while afterward, turning it over the way she'd once turned over Threx Kell's recorded message. Not because it changed anything about what had happened in that hall 2 years earlier, but because it confirmed something she had chosen, at the time, simply to believe without proof. That the smallest version of an ending was very often also the truest one, and that a fight ended cleanly enough could go on doing quiet work in a person's life long after the bruises and the reprimands and the review board's formal record had all faded into an old story other cadets told each other over mess hall trays. She did not write back that night. She waited 2 days, until the posting's own rhythm had settled enough to give her something honest and unhurried to say, and then sent a short reply of her own, no more than 4 sentences, because that, she decided somewhere in the last 6 weeks, was becoming something closer to a genuine habit than a joke Sergeant Voss had made at her expense. Glad to hear it, Kell. Tell your cadet the story matters less than the practice. Tell her I said that, if it helps, though I suspect it won't, the same way it didn't help coming from me the first time. Some lessons only take once someone's actually been on the mat. Outside the small viewport above her bunk, the stars held their slow, patient wheel, indifferent to redacted ratings and council testimony, and every argument anyone had ever built about what a species was in the abstract, before they'd bothered to watch what any one of its people actually did with their hands when it mattered. Somewhere behind her, 110 cadets and 1 old marshal and a Melara records specialist and a Vhoran cadet learning, slowly, what restraint actually looked like when it wasn't a performance, were all carrying some small piece of an afternoon on a padded floor forward into whatever came next for each of them. Ren closed her eyes and let the ship's quiet hum carry her towards sleep, and did not think even once about what any of it had proven. She had never been trying to prove anything. She had only ever been doing the job in front of her, as small as the job would go one calm, unhurried motion at a time, and letting that finally be enough of an answer for anyone patient enough to actually watch.